They dropped from the heavens and raced across bridges, betting everything on one bold strike to end the war by Christmas. Operation Market Garden was one of the most ambitious Allied offensives of the Second World War, a sweeping gamble that combined paratroopers dropping deep behind enemy lines with armoured columns racing across bridges in the Netherlands. The plan was simple on paper yet impossibly complex in execution. Seize a series of key bridges over Dutch rivers, push into the industrial heart of Germany, and strike a decisive blow against the crumbling Third Reich. For a moment the skies were filled with thousands of parachutes as American, British, and Polish paratroopers descended into occupied territory, their courage matched only by the immense risks they faced. Below, tanks and infantry pressed forward on a single narrow road, hoping to link up before German reinforcements could react. But the gamble soon revealed its flaws: stiff resistance, unexpected enemy strength, logistical chaos, and bitter urban fighting at Arnhem turned triumph into tragedy. What was meant to be a quick strike became a desperate struggle for survival, and the dream of ending the war early was crushed beneath the weight of hard reality. Tonight, as you listen, we will trace the soaring hopes, the fierce battles, the human cost, and the ultimate failure of Market Garden, a story of courage, sacrifice, and lessons written in blood. So settle in, get comfortable, and let history carry you through this gripping chapter of World War II. And as always, drop a comment to let us know where you're listening from and what time it is right now. We love seeing how this global community connects across borders and time zones. The summer of 1944 marked a turning point in the Second World War, as the Allies finally shattered Hitler's fortress Europe in the West. After years of planning, deception, and sacrifice, the landings on the beaches of Normandy in June 1944 had succeeded against all odds. American, British, Canadian, and Free French forces had stormed ashore under a hail of gunfire, mines, and coastal fortifications. The victory in Normandy did not come cheaply, as thousands fell during the bitter fighting across the Bocage hedgerows. Yet, the Allies steadily expanded their beachhead, linking their separate sectors into one solid front. Supplies poured into the beaches, with artificial mulberry harbours and the vital fuel lines known as Pluto sustaining the offensive. German defenders, though fierce and experienced, were ground down by the Allies' superior firepower, numbers, and relentless air support. By late July, the Allies were poised to break out from the cramped hedgerow country that had slowed them for weeks. Operation Cobra, launched by the Americans, smashed through German lines with an overwhelming aerial bombardment. What followed was a sudden transformation of the war in Western Europe. The breakout from Normandy unleashed the full strength of Allied mechanized warfare. Patton's Third Army poured into the breach, racing across the open plains of France at a speed that astonished both friend and foe. German resistance collapsed as divisions were cut off and destroyed in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. Here, entire units of the Wehrmacht were annihilated, with roads choked by burned-out vehicles and fields littered with the debris of retreat. The destruction was so severe that German generals would later recall it as one of their greatest disasters on the Western Front. The Allied advance was now so rapid that logistics, rather than German defense, became the limiting factor. Fuel shortages slowed tanks and trucks as supply lines stretched hundreds of miles from the beaches of Normandy. Despite this, towns and villages across France were liberated daily, with civilians welcoming Allied troops as saviors. Paris, the jewel of occupied Europe, was freed in late August after 4 years of Nazi rule. By early September, it appeared as though nothing could prevent the Allies from storming into Germany itself. The liberation of Paris was more than just a military achievement. It was a symbol that electrified the world. General Charles de Gaulle marched triumphantly down the Champs-Élysées, surrounded by jubilant crowds. For the French resistance, it was the culmination of years of clandestine struggle against Nazi oppression. Across Europe, the news was received with hope that Hitler's empire was crumbling. Yet behind the celebrations lay the grim reality of the German retreat. The Wehrmacht, though battered, was far from destroyed. German units regrouped wherever possible, fighting rearguard actions with skill and tenacity. Bridges were blown, roads mined, and ambushes staged to slow the Allied advance. The Allies, though buoyed by momentum, knew they faced a desperate enemy that would fight hard on its own soil. The coming battles would demand not only courage, but also careful planning and unrelenting supply efforts. As the Allies surged across France, command debates shaped the direction of the war. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower favored a broad front strategy, pressing forward along the entire line from the Channel to Switzerland. This approach ensured that no single Allied force would outrun its supply lines or risk isolation. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, however, argued for a concentrated thrust into northern Germany through the Netherlands. Montgomery believed that a narrow, powerful advance could cut into the heart of the Reich, encircle the Ruhr-industrial region, and bring the war to a swift conclusion. His vision clashed with Eisenhower's cautious insistence on balance and coordination. The debate grew sharper as supply shortages forced difficult choices in allocating fuel and ammunition. With so many armies racing forward, not all could be sustained equally. This tension between strategy and logistics set the stage for the daring gamble that would follow. In the German High Command, alarm spread as the Allies advanced with unprecedented speed. Hitler raged at his generals, demanding counterattacks that were often impossible to execute. The once proud Wehrmacht was fractured, its divisions under strength, its equipment in short supply, and its morale shaken by the defeats in France. Yet the German soldier remained a formidable adversary, trained in defensive tactics and capable of exploiting terrain to inflict heavy losses. Veteran SS divisions were rushed back into the fight, stiffening the resolve of collapsing units. Still, the scale of the Allied advance left many German commanders with little choice but to withdraw. The lines of retreat stretched across Belgium and the Netherlands, as the Germans sought to regroup behind the natural barriers of rivers like the Meuse and the Rhine. Hitler clung to the hope that his enemy's supply problems would buy him precious time. In those weeks, the fate of Western Europe hung in a delicate balance between momentum and resistance. The Allied troops themselves sensed the magnitude of the moment. Soldiers who had slogged through the mud of Normandy now found themselves racing across open countryside, sometimes advancing dozens of miles in a single day. The mood was euphoric, with many convinced that the war might end by Christmas. Convoys of liberated civilians showered soldiers with flowers, wine, and bread as columns of tanks rolled past cheering crowds. Yet amid the joy, exhaustion set in. Weeks of continuous fighting left many divisions worn down, short of replacements, and reliant on thin supply lines. Fuel rationing forced commanders to prioritize armored units over infantry, creating friction between different branches of the Allied armies. Engineers worked tirelessly to repair bridges and roads blown by retreating Germans. Every advance depended on the Red Ball Express, a massive truck convoy system hauling fuel, ammunition, and rations to the front. Without these lifelines, the drive into Germany would grind to a halt. Strategically, the Allies faced a race against time. The longer the war dragged on, the more time Germany had to regroup and fortify its homeland. The Siegfried Line, a vast network of bunkers and defences along Germany's western border, loomed ahead. Crossing it would require immense resources and determination. Montgomery pressed his case for a bold move through the Netherlands, bypassing the Siegfried Line entirely. American commanders, including Patton, lobbied for their own offensives into central and southern Germany. Eisenhower sought to balance these competing ambitions while keeping pressure on all fronts. Meanwhile, Soviet forces were driving relentlessly from the east, raising the question of who would reach Berlin first. The urgency of ending the war before the onset of winter became paramount. In this crucible of opportunity and risk, the seeds of Operation Market Garden were planted. By September 1944, the Allies stood on the threshold of what seemed to be final victory. Their armies had liberated most of France, Belgium, and parts of the Netherlands in just a matter of weeks. Yet beneath the surface of triumph, cracks were forming in the Allied advance. Supplies were stretched thin, fuel shortages crippled mobility, and command disputes divided the leadership. German resistance, though weakened, grew more determined as the Allies neared the borders of the Reich. Hitler's forces dug in, preparing to defend every river crossing and every bridge with fierce resolve. For civilians across occupied Europe, the hope of liberation was tempered by fear of the battles still to come. The question was no longer whether the Allies would invade Germany, but how and when they would deliver the decisive blow. It was here, amid triumph and uncertainty, that Montgomery proposed his bold gamble. And so began the story of Operation Market Garden, the daring strike that aimed to end the war by Christmas, but instead would become one of its most tragic failures. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery was one of the most recognizable and controversial commanders of the Second World War. Known for his distinctive beret and crisp demeanor, Montgomery projected an image of confidence that inspired many but irritated others. He was a man of precision, believing in meticulous planning and absolute discipline within his ranks. His soldiers often admired him for the clarity of his orders and the care he took to minimize unnecessary casualties. At the same time, his arrogance and self-promotion earned him a reputation as difficult among his peers. Montgomery rarely hesitated to criticize his fellow commanders, even in public, which bred resentment in the Allied high command. His victories in North Africa, particularly at El Alamein, had made him a national hero in Britain. Yet those triumphs also gave him a belief that his judgment was superior to anyone else's. He was determined to leave his mark on the final phase of the war in Europe. And in 1944, Montgomery saw the chance to shape history once more. At the heart of Montgomery's vision was his belief in the concept of a single, decisive thrust into Germany. He argued that the Allies should not spread their strength along a broad front, but rather concentrate overwhelming force in one narrow corridor. By striking hard and fast through the Netherlands, he believed they could leap across the Rhine, bypass the Siegfried Line, and strike directly into the Ruhr. The Ruhr was Germany's industrial heartland, brimming with factories, mines, and infrastructure critical to sustaining the Nazi war machine. If the Allies could seize it, Montgomery argued, Germany's ability to wage war would collapse almost immediately. He viewed a bold, narrow strike as the quickest and most efficient way to end the conflict. To Montgomery, Eisenhower's broad front approach seemed cautious, unimaginative, and wasteful of precious time. He believed winter would stall operations, and any delay risked prolonging the war into 1945. Thus, Montgomery pressed his case with urgency and conviction. His gamble was not merely a military plan, but an assertion of his strategic philosophy. Montgomery's insistence on a narrow thrust brought him into direct conflict with Eisenhower, his supreme commander. Eisenhower, an American general of diplomatic temperament, sought to balance the ambitions of his many subordinates while holding the Allied coalition together. He believed in advancing on a broad front, ensuring that no single spearhead risked overextension or isolation. Eisenhower's strategy emphasized steady pressure, gradual destruction of German forces, and a relentless advance across all sectors. Montgomery, however, dismissed this as indecisive and too slow to bring about a rapid victory. Their disagreements were not merely about tactics, but also about leadership and personality. Montgomery saw Eisenhower as a genial administrator rather than a true battlefield strategist. Eisenhower, in turn, regarded Montgomery as brilliant but insufferable, always pressing his own agenda at the expense of Allied unity. This clash of visions became a defining feature of the Allied command in late 1944. Out of this tension emerged the seeds of Operation Market Garden. Montgomery's boldness was shaped by his past successes and his reading of the situation in Europe. In North Africa, he had proven that a concentrated, carefully planned offensive could smash a formidable enemy. At El Alamein, his deliberate build-up of men and material, followed by a decisive strike, had changed the course of the Desert War. He carried this lesson into the European theatre, convinced that patience and preparation could deliver another knockout blow. Now, with the German army in retreat across France and Belgium, he saw the opportunity to repeat that formula on a grander scale. The Rhine River, with its massive bridges and natural defensive strength, loomed as the last great barrier before Germany's heartland. Montgomery believed that if he could seize crossings over the Rhine quickly, the war could end before the year's end. His confidence bordered on hubris, but it was reinforced by Britain's desire to play a central role in final victory. Montgomery wanted Britain to lead the decisive thrust rather than allow American armies to dominate the closing chapter of the war. This mix of strategy and national pride fueled his determination to push forward. The plan that would become Market Garden began to take shape in Montgomery's headquarters in early September 1944. The basic idea was simple in concept but enormously ambitious in execution. Allied airborne divisions would seize a chain of bridges in the Netherlands, stretching from Eindhoven in the south to Arnhem in the north. These bridges would create a corridor for British XXX Corps to drive rapidly forward, linking with the airborne troops along the way. Once across the Rhine at Arnhem, Allied forces would have a direct route into Germany's Ruhr. The speed and coordination required were immense, involving one of the largest airborne operations in history. Montgomery's staff embraced the plan as daring but achievable, if executed with precision. The prospect of bypassing the Siegfried Line entirely was tantalizing to Allied planners weary of slogging battles. Market Garden promised to end the war swiftly, perhaps even before Christmas. In this vision lay both its brilliance and its fatal overreach. Yet Montgomery's plan was also rooted in rivalry and politics within the Allied camp. General George S. Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army, was driving rapidly into central France and pressing for resources to sustain his momentum. Patton's boldness and flair threatened to overshadow Montgomery's own role in the campaign. Eisenhower's broad front strategy meant that Patton, Bradley, and Montgomery all had to compete for supplies, especially fuel. Montgomery knew that only by presenting a bold plan could he secure priority for his armies. He lobbied tirelessly for Market Garden, using his reputation and the urgency of striking before winter as leverage. For Montgomery, the plan was as much about Britain's prestige as it was about military strategy. He wanted Britain's forces to deliver the decisive blow that would be remembered in history. The rivalry with American commanders added intensity to his arguments. The operation became, in part, a contest for influence within the Allied coalition. Montgomery's personality infused every aspect of the planning process. He was known for his methodical attention to detail, demanding that every potential obstacle be considered in advance. His staff worked tirelessly to map out drop zones, road networks, and timelines with mathematical precision. Montgomery's confidence radiated in his briefings, where he dismissed concerns with his characteristic certainty. Critics warned of stretched supply lines, vulnerable flanks, and the dangers of airborne troops landing far from their objectives. Montgomery brushed aside these doubts, insisting that speed and surprise would overwhelm German defenses. He believed that German forces were shattered and incapable of mounting significant resistance in the Netherlands. This miscalculation would prove disastrous, but at the time it reinforced his unwavering belief in success. His determination left little room for dissent, and few dared challenge him openly. To Montgomery, Market Garden was not a gamble, it was the obvious path to victory. As the plan crystallized, Montgomery sold it to the Allied High Command with characteristic force. He presented it as the quickest way to end the war, saving countless lives by avoiding a drawn-out winter campaign. Eisenhower, though skeptical, ultimately gave his approval, partly to maintain harmony within the coalition. The operation was scheduled for mid-September, with airborne divisions preparing for the largest drop in history. Soldiers trained intensively, unaware of the immense risks awaiting them in the fields and towns of the Netherlands. Montgomery's vision had carried the day, and his prestige ensured that resources were diverted to make it possible. In the eyes of many, it was a bold stroke worthy of the audacity that had won victories in North Africa. Yet the plan's fragility was hidden beneath its grand promise of swift triumph. Few could see how perilously close it stood to collapse before it even began. Thus, Montgomery's bold vision became the foundation of what would soon be known as Operation Market Garden. In the aftermath of Normandy, the German Wehrmacht appeared broken and on the verge of collapse, yet the reality was more complex. Entire divisions had been destroyed in the hedgerows and the Falaise pocket, leaving highways lined with charred wreckage and the dead. Thousands of prisoners marched into Allied captivity, a sight that encouraged optimism in Allied ranks. German equipment losses were catastrophic, with tanks, artillery, and vehicles abandoned or destroyed by relentless air attack. Yet beneath this surface of ruin, the German military machine displayed a resilience that shocked its enemies. Units that had been shattered regrouped with astonishing speed, reorganizing under the pressure of survival. Commanders cobbled together new formations from remnants, replacements, and hastily drafted conscripts. Factories within the Reich still churned out weapons, and German logistics officers managed to redeploy surviving units to defensible positions. Hitler, though furious at his generals, refused to concede defeat and demanded continued resistance at all costs. The Wehrmacht may have been battered, but it was far from beaten. A critical element of German recovery lay in the hidden strength of the SS Panzer divisions. Two of these elite formations, the 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions, had been withdrawn from Normandy in battered condition. Instead of being destroyed outright, they were quietly refitted and sent north into the Netherlands to recuperate. To Allied intelligence, their presence seemed unlikely, and their combat readiness was underestimated. But within weeks, these divisions received fresh armor, supplies, and personnel, turning them once again into formidable fighting forces. Stationed near Arnhem, they were ideally positioned to respond to any sudden Allied thrust through the region. Their veterans, hardened by battles in Russia and France, retained an edge in discipline and aggression that few Allied units anticipated. Tanks such as the Panther and Tiger, though limited in number, could dominate the battlefield when used skillfully. The SS officers, trained in mobile warfare, prepared their men for counterattacks and ambushes. Their existence would soon become a decisive factor in the unfolding drama. German morale in late 1944 was paradoxical, caught between despair and grim determination. The defeats in France had shaken confidence, but Nazi propaganda painted the retreat as a temporary setback. Radio broadcasts assured civilians and soldiers alike that Germany possessed secret weapons and that ultimate victory was still possible. For frontline soldiers, the immediate reality was harsher, dwindling supplies, reduced rations, and constant bombardment from Allied aircraft. Still, a core of fanatical loyalty remained, especially within SS units indoctrinated with Nazi ideology. Many soldiers fought not for victory, but simply for survival, knowing that surrender could mean humiliation or imprisonment. Others clung to the belief that if they held out long enough, divisions from the Eastern Front or miracle weapons could turn the tide. Hitler's refusal to admit defeat gave psychological cover for continued resistance, however irrational it seemed. For many, the war had become existential, a fight for their homeland itself. This combination of fear, indoctrination, and desperation kept German units fighting long after rational hope had faded. Leadership within the German command structure was another decisive factor. Field Marshal Walter Model, known as the Führer's fireman, took command of Army Group B, tasked with defending the Netherlands. Model was a skilled defensive strategist, capable of organizing chaotic retreats into solid defensive lines. His reputation for ruthlessness and loyalty to Hitler made him one of the regime's most trusted generals. Under his leadership, German units regained coherence even after disastrous defeats. He ordered the use of every available soldier, from regular army to Volkssturm militias, to block Allied advances. Bridges and roads were fortified, minefields laid, and fallback positions prepared in advance. Model's presence restored a measure of discipline to demoralized troops, convincing them that the war could still be prolonged. He worked hand in hand with SS leaders such as Wilhelm Bittrich, ensuring that armored counterattacks were ready at key moments. This leadership created a defense in depth that would surprise the Allies during their next bold offensive. Strategically, the Netherlands offered Germany both advantages and vulnerabilities. Its flat terrain and waterways provided natural defensive lines that could slow armored advances. Bridges became lifelines controlling movement across rivers and canals, making them both vital and vulnerable targets. The single highway running through Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem was easily recognizable as a potential choke point. German commanders understood that if they held this corridor, they could prevent any Allied breakthrough to the Rhine. At the same time, the Dutch population was largely hostile to the occupiers, providing intelligence to the Allies through resistance networks. German security services responded with brutal repression, executing suspected collaborators and tightening control. The geography also meant that even small groups of German defenders could block much larger Allied forces by destroying bridges or flooding the land. The Wehrmacht's ability to improvise made them especially dangerous in such an environment. Thus, while the Netherlands seemed a weak link to Allied planners, to German defenders it became a fortress of rivers, canals, and towns. In this setting, Market Garden would meet its greatest challenges. The Luftwaffe, though diminished, also played a role in Germany's continued resistance. By late 1944, Allied air supremacy was overwhelming, but German fighters and flak units remained deadly when concentrated. Airfields in the Netherlands housed aircraft that could harass transport planes or strafe advancing columns. More importantly, German anti-aircraft guns were plentiful, protecting cities and bridges with walls of fire. This meant that any airborne operation in the Netherlands would face ferocious opposition during its drop. German radar and observers provided early warning, allowing defenders to prepare for incoming waves of aircraft. Even though the Luftwaffe could no longer dominate the skies, its presence forced the Allies to remain cautious. For paratroopers descending slowly under silk canopies, even a small number of fighters or flak batteries could cause devastating casualties. This hidden layer of resistance added yet another risk to Montgomery's bold plan. The skies over Holland, like its rivers, would not be uncontested. Another element often overlooked was the German capacity for improvisation under pressure. With shortages of tanks, trucks, and fuel, commanders learned to make do with whatever was at hand. Captured Allied equipment was pressed into service, from jeeps to Sherman tanks. Local Volkssturm militias, though poorly trained, provided manpower for defensive works and checkpoints. Railway lines were repaired quickly, allowing units to be shifted rapidly across short distances. German engineers became adept at constructing makeshift defenses from rubble, logs, and steel. Even shattered units, reduced to a fraction of their original strength, were reformed into battle groups known as Kampfgruppen. These ad hoc formations were small but flexible, combining infantry, armor, and artillery under experienced officers. Their mobility and adaptability made them dangerous opponents in the fluid battlefield of the Netherlands. For the Allies, this meant that intelligence estimates of German strength often underestimated what they would face. The Germans were masters at creating strength from apparent weakness. By the time Montgomery unveiled his bold plan, German forces in the Netherlands were not the beaten rabble Allied commanders imagined. Though weakened by months of defeat, they were reorganized under skilled leadership, reinforced by elite SS divisions, and supported by terrain that favored defense. Morale was uneven but often hardened by desperation and ideology, producing soldiers willing to fight with ferocity. Their ability to improvise meant that every bridge, every road, and every canal could become a battlefield. Field Marshal Model's presence ensured that chaos gave way to coordinated resistance. The 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions, lurking near Arnhem, represented a hidden steel fist ready to strike at any Allied thrust. The Luftwaffe and flak units, though diminished, added layers of danger to airborne operations. German propaganda continued to bolster hope on the home front, even as soldiers fought with the grim knowledge that defeat loomed for Montgomery and the Allies. The assumption that the enemy was finished would prove a fatal miscalculation. In truth, Germany was bloodied, but far from powerless. The Netherlands in 1944 was a country defined as much by water as by land. A landscape shaped over centuries by human effort and natural constraint. Vast dikes stretched across the lowlands, holding back the North Sea, and countless rivers that crisscrossed the region. Canals, both ancient and modern, cut deep lines through farmland and villages, providing irrigation, transportation, and natural defensive barriers. Marshes and bogs, often invisible until stepped upon, could swallow men and machines alike. To armies accustomed to maneuvering across wide plains or rolling hills, this environment posed unfamiliar challenges. Heavy tanks risked bogging down in soft soil, while artillery struggled to find stable ground for firing positions. Even infantry movement was restricted, as every advance required crossing a water barrier of some kind. Bridges became the lifelines of mobility, more vital here than in almost any other battlefield in Europe. The Dutch landscape, peaceful in appearance, concealed countless tactical dangers. For Montgomery's ambitious plan, this terrain would prove a silent but merciless enemy. The rivers of the Netherlands were not mere streams, but formidable obstacles, wide, fast-flowing, and treacherous. The Maas, the Woal, and the Lower Rhine formed natural lines of defense that could not be bypassed without bridges. Each river required careful planning, engineering, and protection if an army hoped to cross intact. Destroy a bridge, and the advance would halt. Hold one, and it became a golden key to the enemy's rear. German forces understood this perfectly, and they fortified bridgeheads with artillery, machine guns, and demolition charges. The Allies in turn had to gamble on seizing bridges intact before German engineers could blow them sky high. This necessity forced airborne troops to land miles away, then rush forward in desperate races against time. The watercourses also limited maneuverability for armored columns, forcing them onto narrow causeways that could be blocked by even a handful of defenders. In such terrain, speed became not only an asset but a vulnerability. The rivers of the Netherlands were more than barriers, they were potential traps waiting to spring shut. Canals were another defining feature of the Dutch battlefield. Deceptively calm but militarily lethal, these waterways, dug over centuries, sliced through farmland and urban areas with precision, often running parallel to roads. For advancing tanks, a canal was a deadly choke point. A narrow bridge or ferry was the only passage, easily defended or destroyed. Infantry found their movement slowed, forced to detour long distances just to cross a narrow strip of water. German defenders exploited these features mercilessly, setting ambushes at canal crossings where Allied columns had no room to maneuver. Even Allied engineers, skilled in bridging operations, struggled with the sheer density of obstacles. Each new crossing required time, equipment, and protection against counterattack. The canals transformed the Netherlands into a maze of artificial rivers, each one demanding control before an army could proceed. For airborne troops tasked with holding these crossings, the canals were both lifeline and death trap. The Allies quickly discovered that in Holland, no advance was straightforward. The canals turned every mile into a grueling contest of endurance and ingenuity. Marshes and boglands added yet another layer of difficulty to the terrain. In many places the ground appeared firm but was treacherously soft beneath the surface. Tanks that strayed from paved roads could sink into muck, their engines whining futilely as crews scrambled for traction. Infantry attempting to cross marshy fields often found themselves slowed to a crawl, their boots sucked down into the mud. For supply trucks, carrying vital fuel and ammunition, the marshes were nearly impassable, forcing them to stay on exposed causeways. The Germans exploited this by mining roads and setting ambushes at every bend, knowing the Allies could not simply drive around them. Night operations became even more hazardous, as soldiers risked drowning in unseen ditches or canals hidden by darkness. The marshlands also provided natural concealment for defenders, who could fire from cover and vanish into reeds. For paratroopers landing in such areas, the risk was catastrophic. Heavy equipment sank instantly, and soldiers were forced to fight half-submerged. What looked like pastoral countryside became, in reality, a battlefield that punished every misstep. The marshes of Holland were a silent but relentless adversary. Central to Montgomery's plan was the highway that came to be known as the Highway to Hell. This narrow two-lane road stretched from Eindhoven through Nijmegen to Arnhem, cutting a straight line across the Dutch countryside. Flanked by soft fields, canals, and dikes, it became the sole artery for XX Corps' advance. Every tank, truck, artillery piece, and supply convoy had to move along this single ribbon of asphalt. The road itself was elevated above the surrounding land, turning vehicles into easy targets for German fire. If blocked or destroyed, the entire advance would grind to a halt, stranding airborne troops ahead of it. Congestion was inevitable, as columns of armor stretched for miles, vulnerable to air attacks, artillery, and ambushes. Engineers raced to repair bridges along the route, often under fire to keep the advance moving. For the men of XX Corps, the road became both lifeline and trap, earning its grim nickname through bitter experience. The highway to hell was not just a road, it was the razor's edge on which the whole operation balanced. The vulnerability of the highway was amplified by the lack of alternative routes. Side roads, where they existed, were narrow, muddy, and unsuitable for heavy vehicles. Tanks attempting to bypass the main road risked bogging down or becoming easy targets for hidden anti-tank guns. Convoys forced off the highway by obstacles often spent hours extricating themselves, losing precious time. Every delay magnified the danger to airborne troops waiting desperately at bridgeheads ahead. The Germans, recognizing this, launched constant counterattacks against the flanks of the highway. Even a single roadblock, an overturned vehicle, a destroyed tank, or a crater could paralyze entire columns. Supply trucks carrying fuel for tanks often ran dry waiting in traffic jams miles long. For the soldiers marching on foot, the highway became a gauntlet, lined with burning wreckage and the constant threat of ambush. Montgomery's entire vision depended on this fragile thread holding together. The highway's importance made it both a goal and a liability in equal measure. The geography of the Netherlands magnified every risk inherent in Montgomery's plan. Success required flawless timing. Airborne troops had to seize bridges intact and hold them long enough for ground forces to arrive. Any delay risked isolating paratroopers, who would then be surrounded and destroyed. The rivers and canals meant there was no easy detour if the highway was cut. Marshes and soft soil eliminated the possibility of spreading out or maneuvering freely. The Germans, defending their homeland, knew the terrain intimately and exploited it ruthlessly. Every canal crossing, every dike, and every raised road became a fortress to be held or destroyed at the right moment. The flatness of the land offered little concealment, turning battles into contests of raw firepower. Civilian towns and villages, nestled along roads and rivers, became battlegrounds that complicated both defense and liberation. Geography did not merely shape the battlefield, it dictated the tempo, the risks, and the stakes. For Market Garden, the land itself was as dangerous as the enemy. Thus, the Dutch landscape set the stage for one of the most daring gambles of the war. Its rivers and canals offered both opportunity and peril. Its marshes turned fields into quagmires, and its dikes created causeways that funneled armies into narrow lanes of death. The highway to hell promised speed, but delivered vulnerability, binding the fate of thousands to a single road. Montgomery's plan demanded audacity and precision, but the geography offered no margin for error. For the paratroopers, every drop zone was surrounded by obstacles that slowed reinforcement and supply. For the armored spearheads, every mile of progress was a fight against both enemy fire and unforgiving terrain. The Netherlands, beautiful and pastoral to the eye, became a labyrinth of hazards in military terms. Here, nature and man's engineering combined to create a battlefield like no other in Europe. It was into this treacherous landscape that the Allies would launch their boldest operation, and it was here that the fate of Market Garden would be decided, not only by men and machines, but by the land itself. Operation Market Garden was conceived as a plan of extraordinary complexity, combining airborne daring with armored thrust in a single synchronized stroke. The operation was divided into two distinct but interdependent halves: Market, the airborne assault, and Garden, the ground advance. Market involved the largest airborne operation in history, with 3 Allied airborne divisions dropped deep behind enemy lines to seize vital bridges. Garden relied on the British XX Corps, a powerful armoured formation to drive north along a narrow road and link up with the airborne units in sequence. The two elements had to mesh perfectly. Airborne troops would hold the bridges, while tanks and infantry fought their way forward to relieve them. If either half faltered, the other would be exposed and vulnerable. The plan demanded flawless timing, rapid movement, and unbroken lines of communication. It was as much a logistical challenge as it was a military one. The success of Market Garden depended not on brute strength but on speed, coordination, and precision. In this sense, it was both daring and fragile from the moment it was conceived. The market portion of the plan relied on the elite airborne divisions of the Allied armies. The American 101st Airborne Division, known as the Screaming Eagles, was assigned the southernmost sector around Eindhoven. Their task was to secure the road and multiple bridges over smaller rivers and canals, ensuring that XX Corps could move north without delay. The American 82nd Airborne Division, the All-American, was placed further up the line, tasked with capturing the bridges at Grave and Nijmegen, as well as holding the vital Oosterbeek heights. At the northern end, the British 1st Airborne Division, the Red Devils, had the most challenging assignment of all, seizing the bridge at Arnhem, the gateway across the Lower Rhine. Each division faced unique challenges, from urban combat to river crossings to holding high ground. Coordination between them was critical, as failure in one sector would imperil the entire chain. Supporting them all was the Royal Air Force and U.S. Army Air Forces, tasked with delivering thousands of paratroopers and gliders into enemy territory. It was a bold airborne ballet, executed on a scale never before attempted. Supporting the airborne effort was the Polish 1st Parachute Brigade, commanded by General Stanisław Sosabowski. The Poles had fought their way across Europe to join the Allies, and their commander was a man of fierce independence and deep suspicion of over-ambitious plans. Sosabowski's brigade was to be dropped near Arnhem in later stages of the operation, reinforcing the British Airborne. His soldiers were highly motivated, determined to prove themselves after years of exile and longing to liberate their homeland. Yet their role was hampered by logistical delays, transport shortages, and weather conditions that would later prove disastrous. Sosabowski himself voiced strong doubts about the feasibility of Market Garden, warning that the risks were greater than planners admitted. His concerns were often brushed aside, as Montgomery and his staff were determined to project confidence. Nevertheless, the Polish brigade remained committed, knowing that their contribution could tip the balance at Arnhem. For Sosabowski, Market Garden was both an opportunity and a looming tragedy. His brigade symbolized both the hope and the vulnerability of the Allied plan. The Garden half of the operation was entrusted to the British XX Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks. This armoured spearhead was to advance along the Eindhoven-Nijmegen-Arnhem highway, linking up with airborne units along the way. The corps was powerful, including Guards Armoured Division, infantry brigades, artillery, and engineers. Yet its strength was concentrated along a single road, a thin corridor, vulnerable to counterattack and disruption. The plan assumed that XXX Corps could advance 64 miles in just 2 to 3 days, an ambitious timetable given the terrain and enemy presence. Engineers were tasked with repairing blown bridges under fire, while supply convoys followed closely behind to sustain the advance. Horrocks himself described the operation with enthusiasm, presenting it as both challenging and achievable. His confidence was infectious, though many recognized that the risks were immense. The success of Garden was inseparable from the sacrifices of Market, for airborne troops would pay in blood to keep the corridor open. The fate of thousands rested on the momentum of this armored thrust. The airborne plan itself required staggering levels of preparation and precision. Nearly 35,000 paratroopers and glider troops would be dropped in the Netherlands, accompanied by artillery, vehicles and supplies carried in gliders. The Air Armada included more than 1,500 transport aircraft and over 500 gliders, escorted by hundreds of fighters. Drop zones were carefully selected, though controversially many were several miles from the bridges they were meant to capture. This decision, driven by concerns over anti-aircraft fire and terrain, forced paratroopers to march under pressure, losing vital hours. Multiple lifts were scheduled across several days, meaning that divisions would not land all at once, but in waves. Weather delays could disrupt the timetable, leaving units isolated and under strength. Communication would be another challenge, as radios often proved unreliable in wooded or urban terrain. Planners expected that surprise and momentum would overcome these difficulties. But in reality, the complexity of the plan left little room for error. The airborne assault was daring, but also dangerously stretched. The timeline for Market Garden was nothing short of breathtaking in its ambition. Planners envisioned airborne troops dropping on the morning of September 17, 1944, securing bridges by nightfall. By the end of the first day, XX Corps was expected to link up with the 101st near Eindhoven. On the second day, the 82nd would be relieved at Nijmegen, after which XXX Corps would push rapidly north. By the third or fourth day, they would reach Arnhem, joining the British 1st Airborne Division holding the Lower Rhine. In total, the entire operation aimed to secure a corridor more than 60 miles long in less than a week. The Rhine, once crossed, would open the way into the Roer and potentially end the war before Christmas. This schedule left no margin for delays, setbacks, or enemy resistance stronger than anticipated. Every hour lost would place airborne units in greater danger, as their supplies dwindled and German counterattacks gathered. The clock itself became one of the greatest enemies of Market Garden. Time, not just the Germans, would decide the outcome. Planners believed that German resistance would be scattered and weak, a critical assumption underpinning the entire design. Intelligence reports from the Dutch resistance warning of SS Panzer divisions near Arnhem were discounted. Aerial reconnaissance showed signs of armoured activity, but these were dismissed as remnants, not full-strength formations. Montgomery and his staff projected confidence, convinced that the Germans were too disorganized to mount serious opposition. The speed of the Allied advance across France reinforced this belief, creating a dangerous sense of overconfidence. Few in command wanted to challenge Montgomery's optimism, especially given the urgency of ending the war quickly. Doubts raised by officers like Sosabowski were politely ignored or brushed aside. The plan depended on the enemy being too weak to resist effectively. In reality, German defences were stronger than imagined, particularly in the Arnhem sector. This misjudgment would haunt Market Garden from its very first day. In the final days before launch, the atmosphere within Allied headquarters was a mix of excitement and anxiety. Maps were studied, timelines rehearsed, and units briefed on their vital objectives. Aircrews prepared for one of the most massive flights ever attempted, while paratroopers packed their gear and steeled themselves for the unknown. Montgomery exuded confidence, presenting Market Garden as a bold stroke that would outflank the Siegfried Line and bring victory by Christmas. Eisenhower, though uneasy, approved the plan, hoping it would satisfy Montgomery and maintain coalition harmony. In mess halls and briefing tents, soldiers whispered about the dangers of long drops and isolated positions. Yet the thrill of participating in such a daring operation lifted morale, especially among airborne troops eager to prove their mettle. Few fully grasped the risks that awaited them in the rivers and towns of the Netherlands. What seemed on paper like a precise and elegant operation was in reality a gamble of staggering proportions. Market Garden was ready to unfold, a bold vision balanced on the edge of disaster. One of the most controversial aspects of Operation Market Garden was the placement of airborne drop zones. For paratroopers, success depended on seizing bridges quickly before German engineers could demolish them, or defenders could dig in. Yet in several key sectors, the designated drop zones were miles away from the bridges themselves. At Arnhem, for example, British 1st Airborne Division was ordered to land up to 8 miles from the vital Rhine crossing. This meant that lightly armed troops had to march across open ground and wooded areas, losing the element of surprise. The decision baffled many officers who knew that speed was essential to success. The reason lay in concerns from the Royal Air Force, which feared heavy losses if planes flew directly over German flak belts near the bridges. Safety for aircraft came at the expense of tactical urgency on the ground. Thus, from the very beginning, a critical tension existed between air planners and ground commanders. That compromise would shape the fate of the entire operation. The dispute between airborne commanders and RAF planners highlighted the clash of priorities within Market Garden. The airborne generals such as Major General Roy Urquhart of the British 1st Airborne and Matthew Ridgway of the American 82nd pressed for drop zones as close to objectives as possible. They argued that paratroopers, lightly armed and without heavy support, could not afford long marches under fire. The RAF, however, prioritized the survival of its transport fleet, fearing catastrophic losses if planes lingered over defended areas. To minimize exposure to anti-aircraft fire, pilots insisted on dropping troops in open fields farther from towns and bridges. This meant paratroopers would spend precious hours consolidating at landing sites before even beginning their assaults. The longer the distance, the greater the chance of German reinforcements arriving first. Arguments grew heated, but in the end, the RAF's position prevailed. Safety of aircraft was chosen over tactical advantage. The seeds of delay and disaster were sown before the first paratrooper even boarded a plane. Another complication was the reliance on gliders to bring in heavy equipment, artillery, and vehicles. Gliders required large, open landing zones, free from obstacles, limiting where they could be deployed. At Arnhem, the need for such fields pushed landing sites even further from the bridge. Glider landings were also perilous, with aircraft vulnerable to flak and crash landings that scattered men and equipment. Commanders recognized that without their artillery, jeeps, and anti-tank guns, airborne units would be severely underpowered against German armor. Yet, accommodating the gliders forced them into tactical positions far from where they were most needed. The wide dispersal of landings also increased the risk of units becoming separated or disoriented. Coordination across multiple landing zones proved immensely difficult in the confusion of battle. What looked tidy on a map turned into chaos on the ground. Thus, the very tools meant to strengthen the airborne assault also weakened its cohesion at the outset. The scale of the airborne operation introduced another major challenge: the necessity of multiple waves. With thousands of men, vehicles, and supplies to deliver, it was impossible to drop everything in a single lift. Instead, the plan required successive waves over several days, each dependent on favorable weather and air superiority. This staggered schedule meant that units landing on the first day would have to fight under strength, often without their heavy weapons or reinforcements. At Arnhem, only a fraction of the British 1st Airborne Division landed on September 17th, leaving them dangerously exposed. The second and third lifts containing crucial reinforcements were delayed by weather and German resistance. Paratroopers on the ground faced the impossible task of holding objectives without their full strength. Every delay widened the gap between plan and reality. The airborne timetable, so ambitious in conception, was fatally vulnerable in execution. Time once again was the enemy. Weather added yet another layer of risk to the airborne strategy. Clear skies were essential for mass drops, as cloud cover or storms could scatter formations and cause disastrous losses. September in northern Europe was notoriously unpredictable, with fog, rain, and winds capable of grounding entire air fleets. Allied planners gambled on a window of favorable weather, but delays quickly mounted when conditions shifted. Troop carriers circling in poor visibility risked running out of fuel, forcing them to abort missions or drop units miles from their intended zones. Strong winds pushed gliders off course, causing them to crash into trees, fields, or even rivers. Every missed drop meant scattered units and lost equipment, compounding the confusion on the ground. German flak added yet another hazard, forcing pilots to maneuver violently and disperse formations. For paratroopers descending slowly under silk canopies, bad weather and enemy fire combined into a deadly gauntlet. The success of Market Garden was hostage to the skies above. Communication failures further magnified the risks of distant drop zones and staggered lifts. Radios carried by airborne troops often failed to function properly, especially in wooded or urban terrain. At Arnhem, British units discovered that many of their sets could not reach headquarters, leaving commanders blind to unfolding events. Messages had to be carried by runners or bicycles, wasting precious time and risking lives. Without reliable communication, coordinating attacks on bridges became nearly impossible. Isolated units fought bravely, but often in ignorance of the wider situation. Reinforcements, when they finally landed, struggled to link up with forward elements already engaged in combat. Misunderstandings led to delays, wasted effort, and in some cases, missed opportunities to seize objectives. The ambitious synchronization between Market and Garden required flawless communication, yet it collapsed almost immediately. Thus, the cracks in the plan widened with every lost signal. Coordination, the lifeblood of Market Garden, was bleeding away from the start. Airborne commanders were acutely aware of these dangers, but were trapped by the constraints of higher planning. Urquhart, Ridgway, and Maxwell Taylor of the 101st each voiced concerns about distances, timing, and reinforcements. They understood that lightly armed paratroopers could not hold bridges indefinitely without armored relief. Yet Montgomery's confidence, coupled with the RAF's refusal to risk closer drops, left them with few options. The prestige of the operation and the urgency of striking before winter silenced many objections. Soldiers were briefed with optimism, told that relief would arrive swiftly and that German resistance would crumble. Behind closed doors, doubts lingered, but the machinery of war had already set the plan in motion. Airborne generals accepted the risks, knowing their men would pay the price if schedules slipped. Their frustration would soon turn to desperation as reality diverged from expectation. Market Garden was becoming a gamble in which paratroopers were the stakes. In the final hours before the operation, the airborne strategy looked daring on paper, but fragile in practice. Troops were set to land far from their objectives, forced into exhausting marches under fire. Gliders carrying heavy equipment would scatter across fields and ditches, leaving units incomplete. Multiple waves, stretched across days, exposed airborne soldiers to isolation and attrition before they could be reinforced. Weather threatened to ground flights or scatter formations, eroding the precision on which success depended. Radios, the supposed lifeline of coordination, were unreliable at best and useless at worst. Commanders who had warned of these flaws now watched as their men climbed into planes with hope in their hearts and uncertainty in their futures. For the airborne troops, their courage would have to compensate for the flaws in planning. They were about to descend into a battlefield where every risk would materialize. The stage was set for tragedy as well as heroism. The success of Operation Market Garden rested heavily on the shoulders of the British XX Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks. Horrocks, known for his charismatic leadership and ability to inspire men, presented the plan with optimism and determination. His corps was the hammer of the operation, tasked with driving 64 miles along a single narrow road from the Belgian border to Arnhem. At its tip was the Guards Armoured Division, a crack formation of tanks, infantry, and artillery. Behind them stretched a column of support units, engineers, supply trucks, and medical vehicles, all packed onto the same slender artery. The role of XXX Corps was straightforward in concept but brutally difficult in execution. Advance rapidly, relieve airborne divisions in sequence, and secure the corridor. Every mile forward meant another bridge taken, another link in the chain toward the Rhine. Yet every delay meant airborne troops left isolated under increasing pressure. Horrocks himself described the mission as a race against time, with the lives of thousands depending on our speed. The stage was set for a desperate push along what would become one of the most dangerous roads in Europe. The spearhead strategy relied on concentrated armoured force pushing north along the Eindhoven, Nijmegen, Arnhem highway. The Guards Armoured Division, composed of Sherman tanks, Cromwells, and supporting infantry, formed the sharp point of the advance. The plan was for the tanks to smash through German defences, leaving infantry and artillery to secure the flanks and clear resistance. Speed was everything. Tanks could not afford to pause for lengthy battles, as airborne troops were waiting at bridges that might be blown at any moment. But this narrow focus created a corridor only a few hundred yards wide, leaving XXX Corps exposed to counterattacks from both sides. German units lurking in the woods, villages, and dikes could strike the column repeatedly, forcing constant halts and diversions. The armor's strength became its weakness, as tanks and trucks jammed into long lines vulnerable to artillery and ambush. Traffic congestion turned the advance into a stop-start crawl rather than the smooth surge envisioned in planning. For every mile gained, minutes bled away, and the schedule slipped further behind. The spearhead was powerful, but its path was precarious. The first major challenge faced by XXX Corps was simply getting onto the highway. The launch point was at the Belgian-Dutch border near Valkenswaard, where German defenders had prepared ambushes with anti-tank guns and infantry. As the Guards Armoured moved forward, they were met with a storm of fire from hidden positions in the woods. Tanks burst into flames, blocking the road and creating immediate bottlenecks. Engineers scrambled to clear wrecks under fire, while infantry hunted down German gunners in a brutal close-range fight. Each delay rippled backward through the column, stalling thousands of vehicles that stretched for miles. The road itself, elevated above the surrounding fields, offered no room to maneuver around obstacles. Even when defenders were cleared, the pace remained frustratingly slow. What had been envisioned as a swift breakthrough turned into a grinding contest of attrition almost from the start. The garden part of the plan was already falling behind schedule. Logistics played a central role in the advance, as XX Corps depended on an unbroken chain of supply to keep moving. Every tank consumed hundreds of gallons of fuel each day, and the ammunition demands of artillery and infantry were immense. Convoys of fuel trucks and supply vehicles followed closely behind the combat units, forming a vulnerable lifeline along the narrow highway. Any break in this chain threatened to halt the entire operation. Engineers were tasked with repairing bridges blown by retreating Germans, often working under fire to lay Bailey bridges across rivers and canals. Without their efforts, the armoured spearhead would grind to a halt in front of impassable gaps. Medical units moved with equal urgency, tending to the wounded and clearing casualties so the road could remain open. Traffic discipline was critical, as even minor accidents created massive delays. The road became a living artery of war, carrying not only tanks and guns, but also the fragile machinery of support that sustained them. Logistics were not secondary to combat, they were the foundation of the advance itself. The vulnerability of the highway soon became painfully clear as German forces struck at its flanks. Small groups of infantry, supported by anti-tank guns or mortars, could block the road long enough to create chaos. Artillery fire rained down on the exposed column, forcing tanks to halt while crews took cover. German counterattacks, often made by hastily assembled Kampfgruppen, targeted weak points in the column with surprising effectiveness. Each time, XXX Corps had to pause, deploy infantry, and clear the threat before resuming its advance. Meanwhile, airborne troops miles ahead waited desperately for relief, counting every lost hour as their positions grew more precarious. The corridor became a constant battleground, defended yard by yard rather than surged through in a sweeping advance. Soldiers nicknamed it Hell's Highway, a term that captured the lethal mix of congestion, exposure, and relentless enemy harassment. For Horrocks, it was a nightmare scenario. His tanks were powerful, but they were chained to a single road under constant threat. The advance was less a charge than a crawl under fire. Engineering units became heroes of the advance, working tirelessly to keep the corridor open. Bailey bridges were constructed at lightning speed, often within hours of a crossing being destroyed. Crews braved sniper fire and shelling as they assembled steel girders and decking across rivers. Bulldozers cleared wreckage, while mine clearance teams swept the verges of the highway. Every time the road was blocked, it was the engineers who restored the flow of men and machines. Their work required not only technical skill, but also immense courage, as they labored in the open under relentless German attack. In some cases, engineers even repaired bridges, while tanks and trucks waited impatiently on the approaches. The advance of XX Karl was as much a triumph of engineering as it was of armored warfare. Without these units, the operation would have collapsed within hours, yet their heroics could not compensate for the sheer vulnerability of relying on one fragile road. Every fix only bought time until the next disruption. General Horrocks himself maintained an air of determination, urging his men forward with energy and optimism. He was known for his ability to rally morale, often appearing at the front to encourage weary troops. In briefings, he acknowledged the dangers, but insisted that the objective was within reach if everyone pressed on. His leadership style emphasized speed and momentum, believing that hesitation would doom the operation. Yet even Horrocks could not overcome the material realities of terrain, traffic, and enemy resistance. Each delay eroded confidence, as soldiers realized the promised rapid link-up with airborne units was slipping away. The weight of responsibility was immense. Thousands of paratroopers' lives depended on his corps breaking through. Horrocks pushed relentlessly, but the road dictated the pace more than his orders did. His optimism became a shield against growing frustration among the ranks. Leadership could inspire, but it could not overcome geography and enemy firepower. By the end of the first days of Operation Garden, the promise of a lightning advance had given way to a grueling slog. XX Corps had fought its way forward, but each mile was contested, each bridge a battlefield, and each delay catastrophic for the plan's timetable. The single highway, envisioned as a corridor of liberation, had become a funnel of death and congestion. Logistics and engineering kept the advance alive, but only barely, as supply lines stretched and casualties mounted. German resistance, underestimated by planners, proved more determined and organized than anticipated. For the airborne divisions ahead, relief was taking far longer than promised. The Guards armoured pushed onward, but the momentum envisioned by Montgomery was already gone. Every hour lost along the highway was bought with blood and frustration. The fate of Market Garden now hinged on whether XX Corps could overcome geography and enemy resistance faster than the airborne could be overwhelmed. The race against time was slipping dangerously out of Allied hands. Long before the first paratroopers climbed aboard their aircraft, the Dutch resistance sent desperate warnings about the dangers awaiting the Allies near Arnhem. Brave men and women, operating in secrecy under the constant threat of execution, reported the movements of German armour in the area. Their intelligence was clear and alarming. SS Panzer divisions, withdrawn from Normandy to refit, had been sighted resting and regrouping in the very sector where British paratroopers were expected to land. Civilians saw convoys of tanks hidden under camouflage nets, columns of armoured vehicles moving through villages, and troops billeted in local houses. Resistance couriers carried these reports to Allied intelligence officers, risking capture at every checkpoint. Yet when their warnings reached the desks of planners, they were often dismissed as exaggerated or unreliable. Some officers feared the resistance might be infiltrated by German double agents, casting doubt on even accurate reports. For the Dutch who watched enemy armour gather in their towns, the signs were unmistakable. They knew disaster was coming, even if the Allies did not. Their voices cried out in the darkness, but they were drowned by optimism and haste. Alongside the Dutch warnings came intelligence from one of the most secretive sources of the war. Ultra-Decrypts, Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park, had intercepted German communications, suggesting that panzer units were indeed present near Arnhem. These decrypts indicated that elements of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions had regrouped in the Netherlands after escaping the maelstrom of Normandy. Though battered, they were re-equipping, and their presence represented a formidable threat to lightly armed airborne troops. Yet, astonishingly, this information was downplayed in the rush to execute Market Garden. Analysts argued that the German divisions were under strength, little more than remnants incapable of major action. Others claimed that even if tanks were present, the speed of XX Corps' advance would negate the danger. Ultra had provided a glimpse into the truth, but its warnings were diluted by interpretation and wishful thinking. Intelligence that could have altered the course of the operation was filed away, seen as inconvenient rather than decisive. The Allies possessed the knowledge, but they lacked the will to act upon it. Aerial reconnaissance also revealed troubling evidence in the days leading up to Market Garden. Pilots flying over Arnhem photographed armoured vehicles concealed in woods, fields and barns. Tracks in the mud betrayed the movement of heavy machines, while smoke rising from workshops suggested ongoing repair and refit. Intelligence officers studying the photographs noted the telltale outlines of German Panthers and Tigers among the trees. These reports were circulated, but within headquarters they were met with skepticism or dismissal. Some argued the photographs showed only decoys or abandoned equipment. Others suggested they were isolated units with no combat value, scattered survivors rather than organized divisions. The evidence, plain to the eye, was rationalized away because it conflicted with the narrative of a rapid, unstoppable advance. Reconnaissance had provided proof of danger, but it was buried under layers of denial. The truth was visible from the skies, yet invisible to those unwilling to see it. The culture of Allied command contributed heavily to the dismissal of these warnings. Montgomery, brimming with confidence in his bold plan, was not inclined to listen to voices of caution. His staff, eager to support his vision and secure the resources needed, reinforced his optimism rather than challenging it. Dissenting voices, such as those of the Dutch resistance or skeptical intelligence officers, were seen as distractions to be brushed aside. Montgomery had built his career on confidence and meticulous planning, and he now believed Market Garden would be his crowning achievement. To admit serious risks was in his mind to undermine the very foundation of the operation. Critics were not only ignored but often sidelined, their doubts interpreted as a lack of faith. The result was an atmosphere in which bad news struggled to surface. Confirmation bias, believing only what supported the plan, took root at the highest levels. The warnings were there, but the will to heed them was not. Among those most vocal in raising alarms was General Stanisław Sosabowski, commander of the Polish 1st Parachute Brigade. A hardened veteran with a reputation for blunt honesty, Sosabowski studied the intelligence and declared the plan dangerously flawed. He warned that his paratroopers would face armored units they could not possibly defeat with light weapons. His objections were met with irritation, as Montgomery and his staff dismissed him as overly cautious or pessimistic. Sosabowski's Polish troops, who had fought with courage across Europe, were eager for action, yet their commander understood the imbalance they faced. He demanded stronger assurances of support, more reconnaissance, and contingency planning in case of failure. Instead, his reputation for stubbornness grew, and his warnings were brushed aside as unwelcome. The tragedy was that Sosabowski's analysis proved accurate almost to the letter. His foresight highlighted the gap between reality and Allied optimism. But in the fever of ambition, his words were ignored, and the price would be paid in blood. Montgomery's decision to dismiss the warnings stemmed from more than just arrogance. It was also shaped by strategic urgency. The Allied advance had outrun its supply lines, and winter threatened to stall operations for months. He believed that only by striking boldly and immediately could the Allies secure a decisive victory before the year ended. To hesitate or reconsider was, in his view, to squander momentum and give the Germans time to recover. Every piece of intelligence that suggested danger threatened to delay his operation. Montgomery chose to interpret the evidence in ways that supported his plan, downplaying threats and emphasizing opportunities. His confidence, once a strength, became a blindfold that obscured critical risks. He gambled that even if panzers were present, they were too weak and scattered to stop the advance. The possibility of organized, determined resistance was set aside in favor of speed and audacity. In doing so, Montgomery set the stage for a confrontation his paratroopers were unprepared to face. The failure to act on intelligence created a chasm between perception and reality on the battlefield. Allied planners envisioned a weakened enemy, incapable of coordinated defense, holding little more than rearguard forces. The truth was that Germany still possessed elite armored units, battle-hardened and determined to defend their homeland. Dutch civilians watched tanks roll through their towns, yet soldiers preparing for the drops were told they would face little more than scattered resistance. When paratroopers landed, many expected quick marches to their objectives, not desperate battles against panzers. The gulf between expectation and experience would become brutally apparent within hours of the operation's start. The optimism that fueled the plan left soldiers vulnerable to shock and confusion. For airborne units, this meant facing armor without anti-tank support, radios without signals, and reinforcements delayed by weather and logistics. The ignored warnings turned into deadly reality as the first shots were fired. What intelligence had foreseen, the battlefield confirmed with blood. In hindsight, the story of Market Garden is inseparable from the intelligence that was ignored. The Dutch resistance, ultra-decrypts, and aerial reconnaissance all pointed to the presence of German armor near Arnhem. Officers like Sosabowski raised alarms, yet their concerns were dismissed in the rush toward bold action. Montgomery's confidence, Eisenhower's desire for coalition harmony, and the intoxicating prospect of ending the war by Christmas all conspired to suppress caution. The result was a plan built on shaky assumptions, blind to the dangers that lay ahead. When the operation began, paratroopers dropped into fields already shadowed by enemy tanks. The consequences of disregarding intelligence were immediate and catastrophic, shaping the battle from its very first moments. In the end, the warnings had not been absent. They had been silenced. Market Garden marched forward with eyes wide shut. The tragedy was not that the danger was unknown, but that it was unheeded. On the morning of September 17, 1944, the skies over England thundered with the sound of engines as the greatest airborne armada in history prepared to depart. More than 1,500 transport aircraft, supported by over 500 gliders and escorted by swarms of fighters, filled the airfields with motion and noise. Soldiers of the 101st 82nd and British 1st Airborne Divisions gathered around their planes, checking equipment, strapping on parachutes, and steeling themselves for what lay ahead. The mood was tense, a mixture of excitement, fear, and determination, as men scrawled letters to loved ones or joked nervously with comrades. Ground crews worked furiously to fuel, load, and position aircraft in endless lines that stretched across the countryside. Civilians living near the airfields watched in awe as wave after wave of planes took off, their droning engines shaking windows and rattling doors. The sheer scale of the operation was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was not merely a battle, it was a spectacle of airborne power designed to shock the enemy and inspire the Allies. At precisely timed intervals, the great air fleets rose into the sky and turned eastward. Operation Market Garden had begun with a roar that echoed across two nations. The armada stretched for miles across the sky, a vast formation of aircraft so dense that observers on the ground described it as a moving highway in the heavens. C-47 Dakotas droned steadily in formation, their wings gleaming in the sun, while lumbering gliders trailed behind like silent shadows. Fighter escorts darted overhead, weaving patterns of protection against the threat of the Luftwaffe. For the paratroopers packed into the transports, the journey was a mixture of monotony and dread. Inside the noisy fuselages, men sat shoulder to shoulder, their gear heavy and their nerves taut. Some prayed silently, others smoked, while a few tried to sleep despite the constant vibration. Briefings were recalled in hushed conversations, as maps were checked and objectives whispered again and again. The journey across the channel felt endless, each minute bringing them closer to enemy territory. Below, ships of the Royal Navy and Allied convoys looked up as the vast formation passed overhead. It was as if the entire weight of the Allied war machine was now riding on wings of canvas and steel. As the Armada crossed into occupied Europe, German defences came alive with fire. Flak batteries opened up with thunderous bursts, filling the skies with black clouds of shrapnel. Explosions rocked the formations, tearing holes in wings and fuselages, sending shivers through the tightly packed men inside. Pilots fought to hold course, weaving just enough to survive without breaking formation. Paratroopers flinched as fragments clanged against the metal hulls of their planes, some whispering prayers, others gripping weapons with white knuckles. From the ground, Dutch civilians stared upward, watching the sky torn by fire and filled with the rumble of engines. For many, it was the first sign that liberation was at hand, though they knew it would bring battle and bloodshed to their towns. Some aircraft trailed smoke, limping forward, while others spiraled downward in flames, crashing into fields and villages. Inside the formations, discipline held, but fear was palpable, etched into the faces of men about to leap into chaos. The greatest airborne operation in history was now a race through flak and fire. When the green lights finally flicked on, the moment of truth arrived. Doors were flung open, and wind roared into the fuselage as jumpsters shouted commands. One by one, paratroopers hurled themselves into the sky, their parachutes snapping open with violent jerks. For a few heart-stopping seconds, the air was filled with men drifting downward like thousands of dandelion seeds scattered by the wind. Below, fields and forests stretched out, dotted with canals, roads, and villages that looked deceptively peaceful from above. Machine guns barked from the ground, bullets whistling through the canopies, while flak bursts still echoed in the distance. Some men landed smoothly in open fields, while others splashed into ditches, rivers, or hedgerows, fighting to cut free from tangled cords. Equipment bundles drifted down on colored parachutes, though many missed their marks, scattering vital weapons and supplies across miles. The air was alive with shouts, gunfire, and the rustle of descending silk. The descent was over in minutes, but for those who lived it, it felt like an eternity suspended between life and death. On the ground, confusion reigned as units struggled to assemble under fire. In the drop zones near Eindhoven, the 101st Airborne scattered across fields crisscrossed by dikes and canals, some men wading waist-deep through mud and water. Commanders blew whistles, waved flags, and tried desperately to gather their companies into fighting formations. Radios often failed, leaving officers with little sense of where their troops had landed or how many had survived. Despite the chaos, training and discipline quickly took hold, and small groups began marching toward their objectives. German defenders, stunned by the sheer scale of the drops, opened fire sporadically but were soon overwhelmed by the determination of the paratroopers. In villages along the road, firefights erupted as Americans fought house to house to secure bridges. Engineers rushed to disarm demolition charges placed by retreating Germans, while machine gun teams covered every approach. By nightfall, the Screaming Eagles had secured several key crossings, though not without heavy losses. The first link in the chain of Market Garden had been forged in confusion and courage. Further north, the 82nd Airborne Division landed near Nijmegen and the Oosterbeek Heights, facing its own mixture of success and struggle. The high ground was critical, giving control over the approaches to the Rhine and protecting the left flank of the corridor. Paratroopers scrambled up wooded slopes, clashing with German defenders in fierce close-quarters combat. At Nijmegen, the vital bridge loomed ahead, but delays in assembling forces and stiff resistance prevented an immediate capture. German reinforcements moved quickly to fortify the bridge, turning it into a fortress that would prove one of the hardest fights of the operation. Meanwhile, scattered drop patterns left some American units cut off, forcing them to fight isolated battles in farmhouses and villages. Supplies, dropped by gliders and parachutes, landed unevenly, leaving some units flush with ammunition, while others went without. The 82nd faced a constant dilemma: push toward Nijmegen or consolidate positions on the heights. Their struggle would shape the entire battle for the central corridor. Victory here would come at a terrible cost. At Arnhem, the British 1st Airborne Division faced the greatest challenge of all. Their drop zones, miles from the bridge, forced men to march across wooded terrain before even reaching their objectives. Communication failed almost immediately, with radios proving unreliable in the dense forests. Only Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's battalion, moving swiftly and decisively, managed to reach the bridge itself by evening. The rest of the division became entangled in firefights along the route, slowed by ambushes, roadblocks, and confusion. Frost's men dug in at the northern end of the bridge, facing German armor with little more than Piat launchers and small arms. Their courage was extraordinary, but their isolation was alarming. The bulk of the division, scattered and delayed, would not reach them in time. Already, SS units were mobilizing, moving tanks and infantry toward Arnhem. The stage was set for a brutal siege that would define the entire operation. By the end of September 17th, the first day of Market Garden, the results were mixed, spectacular in scale, daring in execution, but riddled with cracks. Thousands of paratroopers were on the ground, holding key crossings and positions, yet many objectives remained unsecured. Bridges at Sun and Nijmegen were still contested or destroyed, while at Arnhem only a fraction of the British force held the crucial span. Supplies were scattered, units were fragmented, and communications were unreliable. Still, the sheer audacity of the operation had stunned the Germans, who scrambled to regroup. Civilians, peering from windows or cheering in the streets, welcomed the paratroopers as liberators even as battles raged through their towns. The Allies had seized a foothold, but the timetable was already slipping, and German counterattacks were gathering strength. Market Garden had begun with spectacle and courage, but beneath the triumph lay the seeds of tragedy. The airborne troops had jumped into history, but they had also jumped into a storm. The outcome would hinge on whether relief could arrive before it was too late. The mission of the 101st Airborne Division on September 17th was clear but perilous: seize the bridges north of Eindhoven and secure the road corridor for the advance of XXX Corps. Known as the Screaming Eagles, the division carried with it a reputation for toughness forged in Normandy and Sicily. Under the command of Major General Maxwell Taylor, their task was to capture 4 critical crossings at Vegel, St. Odin Road, Best and Sun. Each bridge represented a lifeline for the armoured columns that would follow, and any delay could jeopardize the entire plan. The drop zones near Eindhoven scattered the paratroopers across farmland, hedgerows and villages, creating immediate confusion. Units regrouped quickly, guided by whistles, coloured panels and sheer instinct, but the march toward objectives was already delayed. German resistance, though initially disorganized, stiffened quickly as local garrisons and ad hoc Kampfgruppen mobilized. Every farmhouse, ditch and tree line concealed enemy fire that slowed the American advance. The Screaming Eagles moved forward regardless, knowing their success was vital to Market Garden's survival. Their baptism of fire in Holland had begun. One of the first objectives was the bridge at St. Odin Road, where paratroopers encountered determined German opposition. The village straddled the Dommel River, and the bridge was heavily defended with machine guns and anti-tank weapons. The Americans pushed forward through narrow streets, their progress measured house by house as civilians hid in cellars. Snipers fired from church towers, forcing paratroopers to call in mortars to clear the defenders. Engineers exposed on the bridge itself worked frantically to remove demolition charges before they could be detonated. Every moment was a battle of nerves, as a single explosion could undo the entire effort. After hours of bitter fighting, the Americans secured the crossing, cheering as the bridge remained intact. Civilians emerged cautiously, some offering water and bread to the exhausted troops. The victory at St. Odin Road gave XXX Corps a future crossing point, but the cost in time and lives was high. It was a reminder that every bridge in Holland would be contested to the last. At Vegel, the paratroopers faced another fierce battle for control of a vital crossing. German forces, including elements of armoured reconnaissance, resisted fiercely with automatic weapons and mortars. The 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment attacked with determination, using bazookas and grenades to clear enemy strongpoints. Street fighting erupted in the town itself, with Americans kicking down doors, tossing grenades and clearing rooms one by one. Civilians fled in terror as firefights raged through their homes, while others stayed hidden, praying for liberation. After several hours of brutal close-quarters combat, the Americans secured the bridge and established defensive positions. Engineers once again swept the span for explosives, cutting wires and disarming charges laid by retreating Germans. The bridge remained intact, a critical success that allowed the corridor to remain open. Yet the fighting left Weggel scarred, with smouldering buildings and streets littered with debris. The paratroopers had won, but they knew greater challenges still lay ahead. The most dramatic confrontation came at Sun, where the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment was tasked with capturing the bridge over the Wilhelmina Canal. The Germans, aware of its importance, had fortified the approaches with machine guns, mortars, and hidden demolitions. As the paratroopers advanced, they were met with intense fire that pinned them down in ditches and hedgerows. Officers rallied their men, leading assaults through fields and across open ground under a hail of bullets. After hours of fighting, the Americans stormed into Sun, pushing the defenders back toward the bridge. Engineers raced forward to secure it, only to see German troops ignite the charges at the last moment. With a deafening explosion, the bridge erupted in smoke and fire, collapsing into the canal below. The paratroopers stared in frustration, their objective destroyed, just as victory seemed within reach. Sun Bridge, the gateway for XX Corps' advance, was gone. The destruction created a crisis that threatened the entire operation. The loss of the Sun Bridge transformed the battlefield into a desperate engineering challenge. Without it, the armored spearhead of XX Corps would be unable to cross the canal and link up with the paratroopers. Engineers of the 101st moved in immediately, surveying the twisted wreckage and planning alternatives. They lacked the heavy equipment needed for a full rebuild, but they improvised with local materials and ingenuity. Bulldozers pushed rubble into the water to form makeshift causeways, while rafts were prepared for light crossings. Supplies were requisitioned from Dutch civilians, who contributed boats, planks, and tools to the effort. Meanwhile, German artillery shelled the area, forcing engineers to work under constant fire. Paratroopers provided covering fire, holding off counterattacks while the bridge site was secured. Time was the enemy, for XX Corps was already moving north and would soon be stalled at the canal. The engineers knew the entire weight of Market Garden rested on their shoulders. Their task was nothing less than to rebuild the road to Arnhem. The British engineers of XX Corps soon arrived to join the effort, bringing with them the secret weapon of Allied mobility, Bailey bridges. These prefabricated steel structures could be assembled quickly and laid across rivers, restoring crossings in hours rather than days. Trucks carrying bridge sections rolled up under fire, their crews unloading girders and decking with remarkable speed. Working alongside American engineers, they began constructing a replacement bridge at Sun as shells whistled overhead. The work demanded not only technical skill, but also immense courage, as every man was exposed on the open site. Paratroopers held the perimeter, exchanging fire with German defenders, determined to prevent the crossing. Civilians, risking their lives, assisted by carrying tools and guiding soldiers through the village. Slowly, piece by piece, the Bailey Bridge took shape, rising from the ruins of its predecessor. It became a symbol of Allied ingenuity, resilience, and determination in the face of disaster. Where the Germans had destroyed, the Allies rebuilt with unyielding resolve. The rebuilding of the Sun Bridge delayed XX Corps by crucial hours, time that the Germans used to strengthen their defenses further north. The timetable of Market Garden, already fragile, slipped further out of reach with every passing moment. For the men of the 101st, the destruction of the bridge was a bitter blow, but their determination never wavered. They continued to secure surrounding villages, clear German strongpoints, and expand the corridor for the armored advance. Engineers worked day and night, completing the Bailey Bridge under constant fire, knowing that failure meant disaster for the entire plan. By September 18th, tanks of XX Corps finally rumbled across the new span, greeted with cheers by the exhausted paratroopers. Yet the delay had already set back the schedule for linking up with the 82nd at Nijmegen. Time lost at sun would ripple forward, haunting the entire operation. The paratroopers had done their duty, but fate had intervened with fire and steel. Market Garden's first great setback had unfolded in the fields of Sun. Despite the setbacks, the Screaming Eagles achieved remarkable successes in their sector. They had secured multiple bridges intact, defended their corridor against counterattacks, and held open the road for XX Corps. Their courage and determination under fire set the tone for the rest of the operation. Yet the destruction of the Sun Bridge illustrated the fragility of the entire plan. One lost crossing could unravel the timetable for victory. The engineers' heroism in rebuilding the bridge salvaged the effort, but at the cost of precious time. German forces, emboldened by the delay, prepared to contest every mile of the road north. Civilians, though joyful at liberation, saw their towns turned into battlegrounds and their bridges shattered by war. For the 101st, the mission was both triumph and tragedy, a testament to their resilience and the harsh realities of war. They had secured Eindhoven, but the road ahead was long and perilous. Market Garden's fate now depended on whether the next links in the chain could hold. The 82nd Airborne Division, known as the All-American, was tasked with securing the central sector of Market Garden, a mission that carried immense strategic weight. Their objectives included capturing the Nijmegen Bridge over the Wall River and holding the Oosterbeek Heights, high ground that overlooked the entire corridor. The heights were vital, for they commanded the approaches into the Netherlands and threatened the flank of XX Corps' advance. Without them secured, German counterattacks could cut the narrow road to Arnhem in half. Under Major General James Gavin, the 82nd landed near Oosterbeek in scattered drops, fighting immediately to seize the ridges. The terrain was wooded and broken, offering cover for defenders, but also complicating communication and coordination. German forces were already active in the area, rushing reinforcements to contest the landings. The paratroopers, burdened by equipment, fought uphill against machine guns and mortars to establish control. By nightfall, the division had taken positions on the heights, but the fight for Nijmegen was only beginning. The bridge that spanned the wall would prove the toughest objective of all. Nijmegen itself was a formidable challenge, a city cut by waterways and dominated by the massive road and rail bridges over the Wall River. The road bridge in particular was one of the longest in Europe, stretching nearly 2,000 feet across fast-flowing water. German defenders understood its importance and fortified it heavily with machine guns, artillery, and demolition charges. When elements of the 82nd approached, they found the approaches bristling with resistance, with snipers firing from rooftops and barricades blocking the streets. Attempts to push directly toward the bridge met with withering fire, forcing paratroopers to withdraw and regroup. The urban environment turned every street into a kill zone, with German units using basements, attics, and rubble for cover. Civilians fled into cellars or cowered behind shuttered windows as firefights raged in their neighborhoods. The Americans faced not only organized Wehrmacht defenders, but also SS reinforcements arriving steadily from the north. The bridge remained tantalizingly close, yet fiercely defended, a prize the Germans would not yield easily. Each hour of delay tightened the grip of resistance on the city. The Oosterbeek Heights, though secured, proved to be a constant battlefield rather than a safe haven. German counterattacks hammered the paratroopers, seeking to drive them off the ridges and cut the Allied corridor. Infantry supported by armor probed the American lines, forcing firefights in the woods and along farm tracks. The 82nd dug in, using foxholes and captured weapons to repel repeated assaults. Gavin personally visited the front, urging his men to hold at all costs, knowing the heights were the shield protecting the corridor. German artillery shelled the ridges, and mortar fire fell relentlessly, but the Americans held firm. At night, patrols skirmished in the forests, fighting hand-to-hand in the darkness. Losses mounted, but morale remained high, as the men understood their position was critical. Holding the Oosterbeek heights came at the expense of immediate assaults on Nijmegen itself. The division was stretched thin, caught between defending the flank and attacking the city. The tension between these missions defined their struggle in Holland. By September 19th, it was clear that capturing Nijmegen Bridge would require more than frontal assaults through the city. German defences were simply too strong, their machine guns covering every approach and their artillery hammering any attempt to cross. American paratroopers tried to infiltrate through alleys and sewers, but progress was agonizingly slow. Each time they were forced back by concentrated fire and counterattacks. General Gavin recognized that speed was slipping away, and every delay threatened the entire operation. He appealed urgently to British XXX Corps for support, calling for tanks to assist in storming the bridge. Communication delays and traffic jams along Hell's Highway slowed the arrival of reinforcements. The paratroopers, exhausted and bloodied, held their ground but could not break through alone. The bridge stood defiant, looming as both opportunity and obstacle. The clock of Market Garden ticked louder with every hour lost in Nijmegen. The solution to the deadlock was bold and brutal. A direct assault across the Wol River itself. Gavin and his commanders conceived a plan to send paratroopers across in canvas assault boats, under the full weight of German fire. It was an operation as desperate as it was necessary, a gamble to seize the far end of the bridge from behind. The 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment was chosen for the task, its men grimly aware of what awaited them. Lacking proper landing craft, they were issued flimsy boats meant for training, with paddles that broke easily under strain. On September 20th, the men assembled on the southern bank of the Wol, crouching under cover as artillery prepared a barrage. The river stretched wide before them, its current swift, its far bank bristling with defenders. The plan called for them to cross in waves, paddling directly into machine gun and mortar fire. Few believed they would survive, yet none refused the order. The assault on the Wol was about to begin. When the order came, the paratroopers heaved their boats into the water and began to paddle furiously. Almost immediately, German machine guns opened up, raking the river with streams of bullets. Mortar rounds exploded in the water, sending fountains of spray into the air and capsizing some boats. Men fell into the current, struggling to swim under fire, their weapons and gear dragging them down. Others continued paddling, shouting encouragement as bullets punched holes in their fragile craft. Smoke from Allied artillery drifted across the river, offering momentary cover before shifting away. Some boats sank halfway across, forcing men to swim the rest of the distance under fire. Casualties mounted, but the waves pressed on, driven by sheer determination and desperation. Dutch civilians on the banks watched in awe and horror, their prayers mingling with the thunder of guns. The crossing was one of the most heroic and harrowing episodes of the entire war. Against all odds, the first waves reached the far bank, clawing their way ashore with rifles and grenades. Soaked, exhausted, and under relentless fire, the paratroopers charged directly into German positions. Trenches were overrun in brutal hand-to-hand combat, with bayonets, knives, and rifle butts deciding the outcome. More waves followed, reinforcing the beachhead until a foothold was established. The Americans fanned out, attacking the defenders from the flank and rear, throwing the Germans into confusion. Meanwhile, British tanks of XX Corps launched an assault on the southern end of the bridge, linking their strength with the paratroopers' sacrifice. The two attacks converged, crushing the defenders between hammer and anvil. By late evening, the Nijmegen bridge was finally in Allied hands, intact, despite the desperate battle. The victory was extraordinary, but came at a terrible price in lives. The Wörl crossing became legend, immortalized as one of the most courageous actions of the war. The capture of the Nijmegen bridge was both triumph and tragedy for the 82nd Airborne. Triumph, because the bridge had been taken intact, a vital link in the corridor to Arnhem. Tragedy, because the delay in securing it had cost days that the British 1st Airborne could not afford. The crossing of the Wörl was a victory etched in blood, a testament to the courage of ordinary soldiers under impossible circumstances. Survivors spoke of the terror of paddling through fire, of watching comrades sink beneath the current, and of the savage fighting on the far bank. Yet they also spoke of pride, of having accomplished what seemed impossible. For Gavin and his division, the battle at Nijmegen was the defining moment of their war. The road to Arnhem now lay open, but the delay had already sealed much of Market Garden's fate. Time lost at Nijmegen could never be regained. The Wörl crossing was heroic, but it was also a signal of how high the cost of Montgomery's gamble would be. The British 1st Airborne Division, known as the Red Devils, faced the most daunting mission of the entire operation, seizing the bridge at Arnhem over the Lower Rhine. Their drop zones, selected for open terrain to accommodate gliders, were disastrously far from the objective, some up to 8 miles away. From the moment they landed on September 17th, precious time was lost as paratroopers assembled and began their long march through woods and villages. Radios, essential for coordinating such a scattered deployment, failed almost immediately, leaving units blind and isolated. Thick forests disrupted signals, while faulty equipment rendered many sets useless. Commanders tried desperately to reach headquarters, but communication was reduced to runners, bicycles, and word of mouth. German patrols harassed the columns as they advanced, slowing their progress and sowing confusion. Civilians attempted to guide paratroopers along back roads, whispering warnings of German tanks in the area. The plan, elegant on paper, dissolved into chaos on the ground. Arnhem, the ultimate prize, grew further away with every lost hour. Amid this confusion, one battalion under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost pressed ahead with speed and determination. Frost, a veteran officer with calm under pressure, led his men through villages and wooded paths with ruthless efficiency. His battalion encountered resistance, but bypassed strong points when possible, intent on reaching the bridge before it could be destroyed. By evening of the first day, Frost's men achieved what few thought possible. They seized the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge. The sight of British paratroopers digging in at the bridgehead electrified both sides of the battle. Frost quickly organized defensive positions, placing machine guns to cover the approaches and Piat launchers to ambush tanks. Civilians in Arnhem watched in awe as the Red Devils fortified their positions amid shops, houses, and offices. German attempts to approach were met with a storm of fire, halting their first counterattacks. For a brief shining moment, it seemed the bold gamble had succeeded. The bridge was in British hands, but they were dangerously alone. The bulk of the division struggled to reach Frost, encountering increasingly fierce opposition as they moved toward Arnhem. German units, including elements of the SS Panzer divisions, were already mobilizing to block their advance. Paratroopers marching through Oosterbeek and the surrounding countryside were met with machine gun fire, mortar barrages, and ambushes from hidden positions. Every road and intersection became a battlefield, forcing them into costly detours. Without radios, coordination between battalions broke down, leaving commanders uncertain of each other's positions. German armor rumbled through the streets, outmatching the paratroopers' light weapons. PR launchers scored occasional kills, but every tank destroyed was replaced by another. Civilians offered food and shelter, but their homes quickly became battlegrounds as firefights erupted inside kitchens and stairwells. Men who had expected a swift march to the bridge found themselves in a grinding urban battle for survival. The division was being cut to pieces before it could unite at Arnhem. At the bridge itself, Frost's battalion endured relentless assaults as German forces threw everything at the small garrison. Tanks rolled forward across the streets, only to be met by Piat rounds fired at point-blank range from basements and upper floors. Machine guns rattled from windows, cutting down advancing infantry in waves of blood and fire. German artillery and mortars pounded the buildings, reducing homes and shops to smoking ruins. Fires raged through the city centre, filling the air with choking smoke that blinded and suffocated defenders. Ammunition ran low, and every bullet had to be rationed carefully. Yet the paratroopers held their ground, fighting from rubble, turning every shattered wall into a fortress. Civilians sheltered in cellars beneath the inferno, listening to the thunder of battle above their heads. The sight of British soldiers holding the bridge became a symbol of defiance, both inspiring and tragic. Arnhem had become a crucible, testing the limits of human endurance. The brutality of urban combat around the bridge shocked even seasoned veterans. German infantry advanced cautiously, supported by armored half-tracks, only to be ambushed at close quarters by hidden paratroopers. Explosions tore through the streets as grenades bounced off walls and detonated in narrow alleys. Hand-to-hand fighting broke out in stairwells, with bayonets, knives, and rifle butts deciding life and death. Snipers perched in church towers picked off exposed soldiers on both sides, forcing desperate efforts to neutralize them. Civilians caught in the crossfire faced unimaginable terror, their homes shattered by shells, their families cowering in fear. Some tried to aid the paratroopers, smuggling food or carrying messages, risking execution if discovered. The British, vastly outnumbered, improvised constantly, turning furniture into barricades and scavenging weapons from the dead. Frost's men fought with ferocity, knowing relief from XXX Corps was expected within days. Each passing hour, however, brought heavier German firepower and greater casualties. Arnhem was becoming a siege with no escape. As days passed, Frost's battalion became increasingly isolated, their position shrinking under constant attack. The Germans brought up heavy guns, turning entire blocks into rubble to dislodge the defenders. Tanks prowled the streets, blasting buildings at point-blank range, while infantry swarmed through the ruins. Frost, moving calmly among his men, encouraged them to hold on, reminding them that help was on the way. Yet supplies dwindled, and the wounded filled makeshift aid stations in basements lit by candlelight. Medics worked frantically, often under fire, while ammunition carriers dashed across open streets at the cost of their lives. Every paratrooper understood the bridge could not be held indefinitely, but none spoke of surrender. Civilians trapped with them shared their suffering, bringing water from wells and comforting the dying. The bridge, once a symbol of opportunity, had become a cage of steel and fire. Still, the Red Devils fought on, determined to hold Arnhem for as long as possible. Meanwhile, the rest of the division fought desperate battles around Oosterbeek, where command had established a defensive perimeter. Here, units cut off from Arnhem dug into gardens, orchards, and schoolyards, turning the town into a fortress. German artillery battered the perimeter day and night, while tanks probed for weaknesses in the lines. Communications with Frost were nearly non-existent, leaving commanders uncertain whether the bridge was still held. Air supply drops, intended to bring ammunition and food, often fell into German hands due to poor signals and enemy fire. Paratroopers rationed every cartridge, every grenade, making each shot count against waves of attackers. Civilians, their homes destroyed, joined soldiers in cellars and bunkers, enduring hunger and terror alongside them. German reinforcements arrived in increasing numbers, tightening the noose around Oosterbeek and Arnhem. The British, cut off from relief, began to realize that they were fighting a doomed battle. The dream of Market Garden was unraveling in the streets and fields of Holland. By September 21st, Frost's battalion at the bridge was exhausted, its survivors clinging to shattered ruins under overwhelming pressure. Ammunition was nearly gone, casualties mounted into the hundreds, and buildings collapsed one by one under German bombardment. Still, they refused to yield until finally, with no hope of relief and no means to fight, they were overrun. Those who survived were taken prisoner, their defiance respected even by the Germans who had fought so bitterly to dislodge them. The bridge at Arnhem, the ultimate prize of Market Garden, was lost. The stand of the Red Devils became legendary, a story of courage and sacrifice that echoed through history. Their defense bought time, but at terrible cost as the rest of the division struggled to survive in Oosterbeek. Arnhem had proven to be more than a bridge too far. It was a battlefield of unmatched heroism and tragedy. For Montgomery's plan, the loss was catastrophic. For the men who fought there, it was a testament of valor that would never be forgotten. The Polish 1st Parachute Brigade, under the command of General Stanisław Sosabowski, was originally meant to play a pivotal role in Market Garden. These men, hardened by years of exile and longing to liberate their homeland, carried with them a fierce determination unmatched by many of their peers. Sosabowski himself was a stern, uncompromising commander, known for his blunt honesty and refusal to flatter superiors. From the outset, he expressed grave concerns about the feasibility of Market Garden, warning that the plan was overly ambitious and dangerously dependent on perfect timing. He believed the airborne troops were being asked to hold positions for far longer than was realistic without immediate relief. Despite his warnings, his brigade was included in the operation, but not with the priority it deserved. Their role was to reinforce the British 1st Airborne near Arnhem, shoring up the position once the bridge was secured. Yet logistical constraints, weather delays, and planning missteps conspired to keep them grounded for critical days. While Frost's men fought desperately at Arnhem, the Poles could only wait in frustration. Their delayed arrival became one of the great tragedies of Market Garden. When the order finally came for the Poles to launch, circumstances had already shifted against them. Bad weather over England and the Netherlands repeatedly grounded their transports, preventing timely departures. Each delay gnawed at Sosabowski, who knew that every hour lost meant more British paratroopers falling at Arnhem. By the time conditions cleared, the battle had entered a desperate phase, with the British perimeter shrinking and the bridge itself under siege. The Polish brigade's drop was scheduled south of the Rhine near Drill, miles from where their comrades were trapped. German forces, already alerted and entrenched, ringed the landing zones with anti-aircraft guns and artillery. As the Polish transports approached, the skies erupted with flak, filling the air with black bursts of shrapnel. Aircraft were hit, paratroopers killed before even leaving their planes, and gliders shredded by explosions. The descent itself became a massacre, with men shot in the air as their parachutes blossomed above the fields. What should have been a reinforcement turned into a bloody introduction to a battlefield already lost to chaos. Those who survived the drop landed scattered and disorganized, some drifting far from their intended zones. Fields south of the Rhine became killing grounds, as German machine guns swept the landing areas. Men scrambled to cut free from harnesses and gather their weapons while under direct fire. Groups rallied around officers and non-commissioned leaders, forming ad hoc units to push forward toward Driel. Civilians, risking their lives, pointed the way and offered shelter to those stranded behind enemy lines. Despite the losses, Sosabowski's men regrouped with remarkable determination, their discipline holding firm under chaos. They knew their mission was desperate to cross the Rhine and reinforce the remnants of the British 1st Airborne. Yet the river, swollen and fast-moving, stood between them and their comrades. Bridges had been destroyed, and German artillery swept the banks, making any crossing nearly suicidal. Still, the Poles prepared themselves for the impossible, determined not to abandon their allies. The attempt to cross the Rhine became one of the most tragic episodes of the battle. With no proper boats available, the Poles relied on improvised rafts, small crafts, and flimsy assault boats supplied by the British. Under cover of night, they launched themselves into the current, paddling furiously as artillery and machine guns raked the water. The Rhine, wide and swift, tore apart many of the fragile vessels, capsizing men and dragging them downstream. Those who reached the far bank often did so in small, exhausted groups, cut off from one another and under fire immediately. The Germans, aware of the crossing attempts, poured shells and tracer rounds into the river, turning it into a killing ground. Only a fraction of the brigade made it across, and even fewer reached the embattled perimeter at Oosterbeek. Civilians on the south bank watched in despair as boat after boat was destroyed midstream. The bravery of the Poles was unquestionable, but the crossing was a near impossible task. Arnhem remained just out of reach, a bridge too far in every sense. On the south bank, Sosabowski organized his men into a defensive line around Driel, holding off German attacks while waiting for further opportunities to cross. German forces, recognizing the threat, pressed hard against the Poles with tanks, artillery, and infantry. The Poles, outnumbered and outgunned, dug into orchards, fields, and villages, repelling wave after wave of assaults. Their fire discipline and stubborn resistance impressed even their enemies, who found themselves delayed despite superior strength. For civilians in Driel, the arrival of the Poles was a moment of hope, as they saw soldiers in familiar uniforms fighting for their liberation. Yet the Poles themselves felt only frustration, knowing their true mission, reinforcing Arnhem, remained unfinished. They watched the smoke rising across the river, hearing the thunder of battle, but unable to reach their comrades. Engineers struggled to gather more boats, but supplies were scarce and German fire unrelenting. Sosabowski urged persistence, but he understood the odds were stacked against them. His brigade fought bravely, but the situation was slipping beyond redemption. Despite their isolation, the Poles attempted further crossings under fire, each one as costly and desperate as the first. By September 22nd, only small groups had managed to reinforce the British perimeter, carrying little more than rifles and courage. Those who made it into Oosterbeek fought alongside the Red Devils, sharing their rations, their ammunition, and their fate. Civilians in the enclave welcomed them as brothers, recognizing in the Poles the same spirit of sacrifice they had seen in the British. But their numbers were too few to alter the outcome, and their arrival, though symbolic, could not change the balance of power. Sosabowski himself grew increasingly bitter, knowing that his brigade had been set an impossible task. He had warned of such an outcome, only to be ignored by planners who insisted the operation would succeed. Now his men paid the price for those decisions in blood. Their courage could not compensate for poor timing and inadequate preparation. The Polish contribution became a story of valor eclipsed by tragedy. In the aftermath, blame for the failure of Market Garden was deflected. and Sosabowski himself became a scapegoat. British commanders, unwilling to acknowledge the flaws in their planning, criticized the Polish general for being uncooperative and pessimistic. Reports accused him of lacking aggression, despite the fact that his men had attempted crossings under conditions no commander could have changed. In truth, Sosabowski had been one of the few to recognize the danger beforehand, but his honesty cost him politically. His brigade's sacrifice was overshadowed by accusations that tarnished his reputation for decades. For the soldiers themselves, the memory of Arnhem remained a scar. They had fought with all their strength, only to be remembered as part of a failure, not of their making. Dutch civilians, however, never forgot their heroism, honoring the Poles in years to come for their bravery at drill. The men of the 1st Parachute Brigade had fought not only for victory, but also for their honor. Their story is one of the most poignant in the entire campaign. The Poles, though denied recognition at the time, became legends in the hearts of those they tried to save. The Polish contribution to Market Garden stands as both a tale of courage and a symbol of tragic futility. Their delayed arrival, their bloody drop under fire, and their desperate attempts to cross the Rhine all highlight the flaws of a plan too fragile to survive reality. Sosabowski's warnings were prophetic, yet ignored, and his men paid the ultimate price for Allied overconfidence. They fought in orchards, villages, and on the river banks, holding ground with valor while their comrades at Arnhem were slowly destroyed. Their story is inseparable from the greater tragedy of Market Garden, a reminder that bravery cannot always overcome poor strategy. For the Dutch people, the Poles became liberators in spirit even when denied their objective in battle. For history, they became an example of soldiers asked to do the impossible, yet refusing to abandon their duty. The brigade's sacrifice was not wasted, for it exposed the cracks in Allied planning that would haunt operations to the end of the war. Their courage lives on in memorials, ceremonies, and the gratitude of those they tried to save. In the ashes of Arnhem, the Poles wrote their chapter in blood and honor. While the Allies were celebrating their initial landings, the Germans were already recovering with astonishing speed. Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, reacted with ruthless efficiency, transforming chaos into coordinated defense. Known as the Führer's fireman, Model excelled at crisis management, quickly moving units into blocking positions. He recognized the threat posed by Market Garden almost immediately, grasping that the airborne landings aimed to seize the Rhine crossings. Within hours he had rallied scattered units and ordered reinforcements to Arnhem and Nijmegen. His headquarters became a hive of activity as messages crackled in from commanders across the front. Trains unloaded fresh troops, trucks ferried weapons, and surviving elements of battered divisions were thrown back into the fight. Model's ability to impose order amid disaster gave the Germans a critical advantage. The Allies had expected confusion, but they instead encountered ruthless coordination. Arnhem, far from being undefended, became a fortress under Model's iron hand. Central to this rapid recovery was the presence of SS General Wilhelm Bittrich and his ICO SS Panzer Corps. Bittrich commanded the 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions, both battered from Normandy, but refitting near Arnhem when Market Garden began. Though not at full strength, these divisions still possessed tanks, half-tracks, and veteran infantry. Bittrich moved swiftly, deploying the 9th SS to block the British advance into Arnhem, while sending the 10th SS south to contest Nijmegen. His commanders, experienced and aggressive, wasted no time organizing counterattacks against the scattered paratroopers. Panthers and Tigers, supported by mobile artillery, rumbled into action, shocking Allied troops who had expected light resistance. The SS divisions brought discipline, mobility, and firepower to bear at precisely the point of greatest Allied vulnerability. Civilians watched in terror as armored columns roared through villages, their tracks crushing cobblestones and their guns sweeping the fields. Frost's men at the Arnhem Bridge suddenly found themselves face to face with tanks they had been told would not be there. The panzers had returned to the battlefield, and with them came the hammer that would shatter the Allied plan. For the British 1st Airborne, the arrival of German armour was devastating. Lightly armed paratroopers, equipped with rifles, machine guns, and a handful of PAAT launchers, were never intended to fight tanks head-on. As Panthers and half-tracks closed in, British defenders were forced into ambush tactics, firing at close range from cellars, gardens, and ruined houses. Occasionally, a PAT shot disabled a tank, erupting in cheers, but each victory came at terrible cost. German artillery reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble, stripping away cover and exposing the defenders. Communication between scattered British units collapsed, leaving Frost's battalion isolated at the bridge. Reinforcements attempting to fight their way forward were cut down by panzers and infantry entrenched along key roads. Civilians trapped in their homes watched as streets became killing grounds of smoke, fire, and shattered masonry. The British fought with extraordinary courage, but they were being ground down by overwhelming firepower. Arnhem was becoming a tomb for the Red Devils. The Americans, too, felt the weight of the counterattack, especially the 82nd Airborne at Nijmegen. German reinforcements poured into the city, manning barricades and transforming buildings into strong points. SS units fought with grim determination, their machine guns sweeping streets and their mortars hammering crossroads. Every attempt to push forward to the bridge was met with intense resistance, slowing the advance to a crawl. German armored cars darted through the city, striking suddenly before retreating into alleys. The Americans, despite their tenacity, found themselves in a battle of attrition that drained time and energy. Meanwhile, the Oosterbeek heights came under repeated German attacks, as Model understood that holding the ridges was essential to cutting the Allied corridor. Artillery shells rained down, forcing paratroopers to fight hand-to-hand in woods and farmhouses. The 82nd held, but only just. Its men stretched thin across miles of contested terrain. German coordination kept pressure on every sector, preventing the Allies from concentrating their strength. Buttrick's panzers were not just resisting, they were dictating the tempo of the battle. Improvised German forces also played a decisive role in stalling the Allied advance. Model and Buttrick cobbled together Kampfgruppen, ad hoc battle groups formed from whatever units were available. These often consisted of a few tanks, infantry companies, flak guns, and engineers, thrown together under aggressive officers. Despite their improvised nature, they were flexible, mobile, and highly effective. Kampfgruppen struck at weak points in the Allied corridor, ambushing convoys, blowing bridges, and sowing chaos along Hell's Highway. Even small groups could paralyze entire columns, forcing XX Corps to halt while engineers cleared obstacles. German discipline and initiative turned scarcity into strength, as every soldier knew the stakes of defending their homeland. Civilians were pressed into labor, digging trenches and building barricades under the eyes of German officers. The Allies had expected shattered remnants. Instead, they faced a network of determined, inventive defenders. These improvised forces bought time for the SS divisions to concentrate their strength. Time, more than firepower, became Germany's greatest weapon. The counterattack at Arnhem grew into a full-scale siege, with Frost's battalion at the bridge taking the brunt. German tanks and infantry launched wave after wave, probing the defences, then hammering them with artillery. Buildings collapsed into piles of brick and ash, burying wounded soldiers beneath the rubble. Yet still the British held, sniping from windows, lobbing grenades down stairwells, and repelling assaults with astonishing bravery. German officers, frustrated by the stubborn resistance, brought in flamethrowers and heavy guns to burn the defenders out. Civilians in Arnhem were caught in the inferno, their homes destroyed, their families killed or wounded. The bridge, intact but contested, became the focal point of a battle that symbolized both Allied hope and German resurgence. Frost's men, cut off from reinforcements, fought on with dwindling ammunition and mounting casualties. German armor circled them like wolves, tightening the noose with each passing hour. The counterattack had transformed Arnhem into a crucible of blood and fire. Elsewhere along the corridor, German counterblows constantly threatened to sever the narrow road. At Veghel and Sun, Kampfgruppen struck convoys with artillery and mortars, destroying fuel trucks and blocking the road with burning wreckage. XX Corps, slowed by these ambushes, found itself forced to fight for every mile rather than rushing north. Supply convoys stretched for miles, vulnerable to sudden strikes from woods and villages. Engineers worked frantically to clear mines and repair bridges under fire, but delays piled up. German resistance was not just tactical, it was strategic, aimed at grinding down momentum and bleeding away time. Each day that passed meant more Allied paratroopers were isolated at Arnhem, surrounded by the tightening grip of SS armor. The corridor, envisioned as a rapid highway of liberation, had become a funnel of destruction. The Germans, against all Allied expectations, had regained the initiative. Market Garden was no longer a bold thrust. It was becoming a desperate struggle for survival. By the third day of Market Garden, the German counterattack had transformed the operation from audacious gamble to looming disaster. Model and Bittrick had coordinated their forces with ruthless efficiency, using elite SS Panzers and improvised Kampfgruppen to crush isolated paratroopers and choke the Allied advance. Arnhem was encircled, Nijmegen was contested, and the corridor itself was under constant threat. The Allies had underestimated their enemy, believing them too broken to resist, but the Germans had proven resourceful, disciplined, and unyielding. Civilians who had welcomed paratroopers with flowers now cowered in cellars as battles raged through their towns. Frost's battalion, heroic but isolated, was doomed, while Sosabowski's Poles fought in vain to break the river barrier. The dream of ending the war by Christmas was slipping away, replaced by the nightmare of attrition and encirclement. Market Garden was faltering under the weight of German recovery. The counterattack had not only stopped the Allies, it had turned their bold gamble into a bloody trap. Arnhem was not just a bridge too far, it was a battlefield reclaimed by German steel and fire. The progress of XXX Corps, envisioned as a lightning thrust to Arnhem, quickly turned into a grinding ordeal. Every few miles, German resistance forced the column to halt, deploy, and fight its way forward. Blown bridges created immediate choke points, requiring engineers to assemble Bailey bridges under fire before tanks could continue. Each delay rippled backward through the column, leaving miles of vehicles stalled on the narrow highway. Soldiers sat in their trucks, listening to distant gunfire, unable to move or fight. Civilians, who had greeted the guards armored with flowers and cheers, now watched with dread as artillery shells whistled into their villages. The thunder of guns replaced the joy of liberation, and the road became a scar of destruction. For Horrocks and his commanders, momentum evaporated with every delay, turning a planned sprint into a crawl. Hours bled into days, and the timetable slipped hopelessly out of reach. Arnhem, still fighting desperately, grew more isolated with each passing minute. Ambushes became the constant curse of the corridor, as German Kampfgruppen struck with lethal precision. Small groups of infantry, supported by mortars or a few anti-tank guns, could halt entire battalions by blocking the road. Tanks were forced to deploy off the highway into marshy fields, where many became bogged down or immobilized. German artillery rained down on the congested column, setting fuel trucks ablaze and filling the air with black smoke. Wrecks clogged the road, forcing engineers to drag aside the twisted hulks while under sniper fire. Even when cleared, traffic discipline broke down, with vehicles bunching up and creating irresistible targets. Allied air support helped suppress some ambushes, but low clouds and flak often kept planes grounded. Each skirmish consumed precious ammunition and fuel, straining already fragile logistics. The German tactic of delay, rather than destruction, was devastatingly effective. Every mile forward was paid for in blood, fuel, and time that the Airborne could not afford. The narrowness of the highway itself compounded the nightmare. Known grimly as Hell's Highway, the single elevated road was bordered by soft fields and ditches that made maneuver nearly impossible. When tanks or trucks tried to bypass obstacles, they often sank into the mud, creating further blockages. Convoys stretched for miles, vulnerable to artillery, airstrikes, or even a single German patrol with explosives. The road became a deadly bottleneck, where the might of XX Corps was compressed into a thin line of steel and rubber. Civilians attempting to flee the fighting clogged the same routes, their carts and bicycles adding to the chaos. Traffic jams immobilized units for hours, leaving soldiers exposed and frustrated. Engineers worked constantly, filling craters, clearing wreckage and patching bridges, yet the flow remained agonizingly slow. For the men waiting at Arnhem, the advance was like a lifeline moving through molasses. The promise of swift relief was being swallowed by the geography of Holland. What had been planned as a corridor of liberation became a funnel of despair. Inside the column, the atmosphere shifted from determination to frustration. Tank crews, unable to fire their weapons in the cramped traffic, sat smoking cigarettes and staring at the horizon. Infantry rode on trucks or marched wearily along the verges, their boots caked in mud, their spirits weighed down by the endless halts. Officers cursed at stalled convoys, blowing whistles and waving flags to restore order amid the congestion. Radios buzzed with conflicting orders, as higher command demanded speed, but the road itself dictated paralysis. Medical vehicles, trapped in traffic, struggled to reach the wounded, who lay waiting in farmhouses turned into field hospitals. The long delays bred impatience, with some units advancing recklessly into ambushes, out of sheer desperation to make progress. Supplies of fuel and ammunition ran dangerously low, forcing commanders to ration every shell and gallon. For Horrocks, watching his men stagnate on the highway, the frustration was unbearable. The entire corps was like a coiled spring, desperate to release its energy, yet bound by the choke of the road. The dream of a swift advance dissolved into a nightmare of stalled steel. For the airborne troops waiting ahead, the delays of XX Corps were catastrophic. At Arnhem, Frost's men fought alone at the bridge, clinging to ruins while wondering when the tanks would arrive. At Oosterbeek, British paratroopers defended their shrinking perimeter, hoping for relief that never came. At Nijmegen, the 82nd fought tooth and nail to secure the bridge, only to discover that XX Corps was too far behind to exploit it quickly. Every day of delay meant dwindling ammunition, rising casualties, and growing despair among the airborne. Messages smuggled out of Arnhem spoke of desperate conditions, men low on food, water, and bullets, fighting tanks with improvised bombs. The paratroopers had been told to hold for 2 days. They held for more than a week, waiting in vain. Their faith in relief became a cruel mirage, as the rumble of tanks remained a distant dream. Civilians tried to reassure them, but even they could see the advancing armor was too slow. The airborne were fighting and dying in isolation. Their sacrifice was being consumed by the sluggish crawl of the ground forces. The slow advance also revealed deep flaws in Allied planning. Montgomery's vision of a lightning thrust had underestimated both geography and enemy resilience. Eisenhower's broad front strategy had already stretched supply lines thin, leaving XXX Corps struggling for fuel and ammunition. The reliance on a single road magnified every setback into a crisis. Planners had dismissed concerns about ambushes, weather, and resistance, believing momentum would solve every problem. Instead, each problem compounded into a mountain of delays that no amount of bravery could overcome. Horrocks, though energetic and inspiring, could not conjure bridges from rubble or force tanks through bottlenecks. The German strategy of attrition proved devastatingly effective against Allied optimism. Market Garden was not collapsing in a single dramatic failure, but bleeding to death through 1,000 cuts. The slow advance was not just a logistical issue, it was the unraveling of the entire operation. The psychological toll on the troops of XXX Corps was immense. Soldiers who had expected a triumphant march to Arnhem now endured a slog through constant danger and frustration. Every village became a battlefield, every hedgerow a potential ambush, and every bridge a test of nerves. Men began to mutter that Arnhem was already lost, though no one dared say it openly in front of officers. The knowledge that comrades were fighting and dying ahead added to the sense of helplessness. The paratroopers' plight became a weight on the shoulders of the armored crews, who pushed forward with grim determination but little hope. Civilians once jubilant now looked at the long lines of stalled tanks with disappointment and fear. Rumors spread of German reinforcements, of panzers massing near Arnhem, of bridges blown beyond repair. The sense of urgency became suffocating, as every hour lost seemed to seal the fate of the airborne. XX Corps was still advancing, but its spirit was fraying under the relentless pressure of delay. The race against time had become a crawl toward inevitable tragedy. By the time XX Corps reached Nijmegen, days behind schedule, the opportunity to relieve Arnhem had already slipped away. The great gamble of Market Garden hinged on speed, but speed had been devoured by blown bridges, ambushes, and logistical nightmares. The armoured spearhead, designed to punch through to the Rhine, had instead been reduced to a plodding convoy trapped on Hell's highway. The men of XX Corps fought bravely, engineers worked heroically, and civilians cheered desperately, but the plan itself was broken. Arnhem, once envisioned as the prize of the operation, was now beyond their reach. The frustration of the ground troops was matched only by the despair of the airborne, who realized help would never come in time. For Montgomery's vision, the slow advance of XX Corps was the fatal flaw, the Achilles heel of Market Garden. What had begun as a bold stroke ended in stalled columns and shattered hopes. The road north had become a graveyard of momentum. Arnhem's fate was sealed long before the tanks ever reached its gates. The battle for Arnhem Bridge became one of the most iconic last stands of the Second World War, a clash that fused courage and tragedy in equal measure. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost and his 2nd Battalion had seized the northern end of the bridge on September 17th, holding fast despite being surrounded by overwhelming German forces. For 3 days his men fought from shattered houses, shops and offices, transforming the city centre into a fortress of defiance. The bridge itself loomed above them, its steel arches scarred by fire and smoke, symbolizing both the promise of victory and the inevitability of defeat. German tanks and infantry pressed relentlessly against the British positions, yet each assault was met with ferocious resistance. PIA teams ambushed armor at point-blank range, while snipers picked off enemy infantry from hidden vantage points. Mortars and machine guns raked the approaches, leaving the road littered with wrecks and bodies. Civilians cowered in basements, listening to the thunder of gunfire above their heads. Arnhem had become a battlefield where every brick and beam carried the weight of history. The bridge was held, but the cost mounted with every hour. German commanders, enraged by the stubborn defense, escalated their assaults with increasing brutality. Artillery barrages reduced entire blocks to rubble, filling the air with choking dust and fire. Tanks blasted holes into buildings where British paratroopers were entrenched, collapsing walls onto the defenders inside. Flamethrowers roared through doorways and windows, incinerating everything in their path. Still, the Red Devils fought on, firing until their barrels glowed and hurling grenades from upper floors onto German troops below. Ammunition grew scarce, forcing men to conserve every shot, sometimes resorting to captured weapons scavenged from the dead. Medics, working in candlelit cellars, tended to the wounded with dwindling supplies, their makeshift hospitals echoing with the groans of men in agony. Civilians brought water when they could, risking their lives in streets, swept by bullets. Despite their exhaustion, Frost's men refused to yield, believing relief was only hours away. Every defender understood they were living on borrowed time, yet none abandoned their post. Arnhem had become a crucible of unrelenting destruction. Inside the perimeter, morale remained astonishingly resilient, sustained by discipline, camaraderie, and sheer defiance. Frost himself moved calmly among his men, encouraging them, issuing orders, and leading by example. His presence gave confidence to soldiers who were weary, hungry, and battered by days of combat. Small groups rotated through defensive positions, grabbing minutes of rest in smoke-filled rooms before returning to the fight. Food was almost gone, and water had to be scavenged from wells or rain collected in helmets. Ammunition was rationed to the last clip, and men carried multiple weapons scavenged from fallen comrades to remain in the fight. The soundscape was one of chaos, the clatter of machine guns, the crash of artillery, the screams of the wounded, and the groaning of buildings collapsing under fire. Civilians prayed in cellars, their whispered hymns drowned by the thunder above. The defenders clung to hope, convinced that tanks from XXX Corps would arrive at any moment. But as the hours turned into days, that hope became a cruel illusion. The German counterattacks intensified, bringing the full weight of SS armor and artillery to bear. Panthers prowled the streets, their guns firing into facades, while infantry advanced cautiously behind walls of rubble. Frost's men, reduced in number and ammunition, fought with increasing desperation. Some paratroopers prepared Molotov cocktails from civilian supplies, hurling flaming bottles onto vehicles. Piet gunners fired their last rounds at suicidal ranges, often from inside burning buildings. The once proud battalion was dwindling, every casualty shrinking their shrinking perimeter. Medical stations overflowed, with wounded men lying shoulder to shoulder in basements that reeked of blood and smoke. Yet even in these dire conditions, discipline held. Soldiers still obeyed orders, still manned positions, still returned fire when possible. Civilians marveled at their endurance, calling them the angels of Arnhem for their courage. The Red Devils were living legends, but their legend was being written in blood and ash. As the siege dragged on, the reality of defeat became undeniable. Ammunition had run dry in many positions, leaving paratroopers to fight with bayonets, knives, and fists. German loudspeakers blared demands for surrender, but the British ignored them, firing what little they had in reply. Fires consumed entire rows of houses, turning night into a hellish glow of orange flames. Smoke choked the air, making it difficult to breathe, while rubble and corpses littered every street. The defenders, exhausted and starving, fought on out of pride and loyalty, rather than any realistic hope of victory. Some prayed quietly in the ruins, others wrote final notes to families they knew they would never see again. Frost himself was eventually wounded, yet continued to command until he could no longer move. The perimeter shrank to a handful of buildings clinging to the bridge's northern end. Arnhem had become less a battle than a slow annihilation. On September 21st, the German onslaught finally overwhelmed Frost's battalion. Tanks blasted through the last strongpoints, and infantry poured into the ruins, clearing houses room by room with grenades and flamethrowers. Survivors, out of ammunition and surrounded, were captured or killed in savage close-quarters fighting. Frost, incapacitated by his wounds, was taken prisoner along with his remaining officers. The bridge, still intact, now fell fully into German hands. For 3 days, a few hundred men had held back an entire corps of panzers, delaying the enemy with defiance beyond reason. Their stand became a symbol of Allied courage, admired even by the Germans who had finally subdued them. But admiration did not ease the bitterness of defeat, nor did it bring back the hundreds who had fallen. Arnhem Bridge, the key to Market Garden, was lost. The dream of a rapid thrust across the Rhine had died amid fire and rubble. The cost of the battle was staggering. Frost's battalion of over 700 men was reduced to fewer than 100 effectives, most of them wounded or captured. The rest of the division, fighting desperately at Oosterbeek, remained isolated and under siege. Arnhem itself was left shattered, its homes destroyed, its civilians traumatized by days of relentless bombardment. German losses were significant but sustainable, while the British could not replace the men or the opportunity lost. For the Allies, the failure at the bridge symbolized the collapse of Montgomery's grand design. For the soldiers, it was a bitter memory of courage squandered by poor planning and slow relief. Survivors marched into captivity, some limping, some carried, but all defiant in spirit. Civilians wept as the paratroopers were led away, whispering gratitude even as their liberators disappeared into German custody. Arnhem had been a beacon of hope, now turned into a graveyard of ambition. The last stand at the bridge entered history as both tragedy and legend. The defense of Arnhem Bridge remains one of the most heroic episodes in modern military history, but also one of its most tragic. The Red Devils had achieved the impossible, holding the bridge for days against overwhelming odds, yet their sacrifice had been in vain. Relief never arrived in time, and their courage could not alter the flaws of the larger plan. Arnhem became the symbol of Market Garden's futility, a bold vision undone by delays, underestimation, and the relentless strength of German resistance. To the world, the image of British paratroopers fighting from burning houses beneath the steel arches of the bridge became iconic. It embodied both the indomitable spirit of soldiers and the futility of a mission doomed from the start. For Montgomery, it was a humiliation. For Eisenhower, a sobering lesson in overreach. But for the men who fought there, Arnhem was not a failure. It was proof of their unbreakable resolve. Their stand was both a monument to bravery and a memorial to the limits of human endurance. Arnhem was, in the end, a bridge too far. After Frost's battalion was overwhelmed at Arnhem Bridge, the remnants of the British 1st Airborne Division fell back to the village of Oosterbeek. There, along the banks of the Lower Rhine, they formed a shrinking perimeter, clinging to gardens, orchards, and ruined houses. For days they endured constant bombardment from artillery and mortars, while German tanks prowled the outskirts, firing shells into their positions. The once quiet village became a battlefield of rubble and smoke, every street a defensive line, every cellar a makeshift hospital. Civilians who had stayed behind shared the suffering, sheltering side by side with paratroopers in basements that shook with every explosion. Supplies were critically low, rations dwindled to crumbs, water was fetched under fire, and ammunition was counted bullet by bullet. Airdrops, meant to resupply the division, often fell into German hands due to poor communication and heavy flak. Soldiers fought with whatever they had left, sometimes scavenging weapons from fallen comrades. The perimeter grew tighter each day, a noose closing around the exhausted survivors. Oosterbeek had become the last stand of the Red Devils. Inside the perimeter, conditions were beyond desperate. Wounded men lay in overcrowded aid stations, tended by medics with dwindling morphine and bandages. Candles flickered in basements, filled with the groans of the dying, while shellfire above shook plaster from the ceilings. Some wounded begged to be left with weapons, determined to fight to the end rather than be captured. Others simply prayed, whispering for the arrival of relief that never came. Soldiers rotated through defensive positions with hollow eyes, their uniforms tattered, their bodies emaciated by hunger and fatigue. Communication with higher command was patchy, and rumors of XX Corps' approach filled men with fleeting hope. Civilians risked their lives to bring water, bread, or words of encouragement, binding their fate to the defenders. Each day blurred into the next, a haze of gunfire, smoke, and exhaustion. The men of the 1st Airborne were trapped, battered, and starving, yet their spirit refused to break. Oosterbeek became a crucible of endurance, where courage was measured in hours survived. German pressure intensified relentlessly as more reinforcements poured into the area. SS Panzer units launched probing attacks, supported by artillery barrages that reduced gardens and orchards to craters. Tanks fired point-blank into houses, collapsing walls onto their defenders. Infantry advanced cautiously through the ruins, only to be met by desperate volleys from paratroopers lying in wait. Snipers picked off men at every opportunity, while machine guns raked the dikes and fields. The British answered with mortars, rifles, and the last of their Piat rounds, holding back the tide as long as they could. Civilians, their homes destroyed, carried the wounded on carts, or sheltered them in barns, refusing to abandon the soldiers who had come to liberate them. The perimeter shrank by the day, compressed into a tiny enclave of shattered houses and blood-stained fields. Men slept in mud, their trenches filling with rainwater, their bodies racked by exhaustion. The defenders knew the end was near, but still they fought on. By September 25th, it was clear that the division could not hold any longer. High Command finally authorized Operation Berlin, the evacuation of the survivors across the Rhine. It was a decision born of necessity, recognizing that the Airborne could not withstand another day of siege. Engineers from the Royal Canadian Army and British units prepared boats in secrecy, ready to ferry men across the river. The plan called for a night withdrawal, under cover of darkness, with small groups slipping through German lines to the riverbank. Silence was essential, no shouting, no lights, no signals that could alert the enemy. Paratroopers received the order with mixed emotions, relief at the chance of survival, and sorrow for those too wounded to move. Civilians whispered farewells, some weeping as soldiers they had sheltered disappeared into the night. The Rhine, dark and swift, became the last barrier between life and captivity. The stage was set for a desperate and haunting escape. As darkness fell, the evacuation began. Men moved in small groups through orchards and ruins, guided by whispers and the faint light of the moon. German patrols were everywhere, forcing the paratroopers to crawl through mud and ditches to avoid detection. Those who stumbled or cried out were silenced quickly for fear of alerting the enemy. At the riverbank, engineers waited with flimsy assault boats, their paddles muffled against the wooden hulls, Under constant shell fire and sporadic machine gun bursts, the first groups launched into the current. The Rhine swallowed men and boats alike, its current dragging many downstream or overturning their fragile craft. Those who reached the far bank collapsed in exhaustion, some too weak to move until comrades pulled them to safety. Others never made it, their bodies swept away in the dark waters. The crossing became a gauntlet of death, where every stroke of the paddle was a gamble with fate. The evacuation continued through the night. Boatload after boatload crossing under relentless fire. Engineers rowed back and forth, risking their lives with each trip, determined to rescue as many as possible. German flares lit up the sky, exposing the boats to machine gun fire from the opposite bank. Mortar shells splashed into the river, capsizing craft and sending men into the freezing current. Paratroopers clung desperately to wreckage, some dragged ashore by comrades, others lost forever beneath the dark waters. The bravery of the engineers was matched by the discipline of the soldiers, who boarded in silence, accepting their fate with stoic courage. Wounded men were carried on stretchers into boats, many whispering thanks before slipping into unconsciousness. Every successful crossing was met with relief on the southern bank, but there was no time to celebrate. The evacuation was a race against dawn, against discovery, against annihilation. Each boat carried not just men, but the last hope of the division. By morning the evacuation ended, leaving behind hundreds of wounded who could not be moved. Medics and chaplains remained with them, surrendering to the Germans in the hope of mercy. Nearly 10,000 men had landed at Arnhem. Fewer than 2,000 crossed the river to safety. The rest were dead, captured or missing, their sacrifice etched forever into the soil of Holland. Survivors on the far bank were gaunt, hollow-eyed, and broken by exhaustion, yet alive. They had endured one of the most brutal ordeals of the war, their courage unmatched but their mission unfulfilled. Civilians who had aided them were left behind, many facing German reprisals for their defiance. Oosterbeek itself lay in ruins, its orchards churned into mud, its houses shattered, its people scarred by days of fire and blood. The haunting silence after the battle was more terrible than the thunder of guns. The dream of Market Garden had died on the banks of the Rhine. The evacuation of Oosterbeek was both a rescue and a tragedy, a testament to courage amid the ashes of defeat. The survivors carried with them memories of comrades left behind, of civilians who had sheltered them, of nights filled with fire and screams. For the British, Arnhem became a symbol of sacrifice, a reminder that even the bravest soldiers cannot overcome flawed strategy. The Rhine, once envisioned as the gateway to victory, had become a grave for hope. Market Garden, planned as a bold thrust to end the war by Christmas, instead prolonged it by months. The men who crossed the river did so with heavy hearts, knowing their courage had been squandered by delays and miscalculations. Yet their endurance ensured their story would not be forgotten. Arnhem became legend, not for victory, but for valor in the face of certain defeat. The evacuation of Oosterbeek marked the final chapter of the battle. It was the moment when hope was ferried across the river and tragedy was left behind. For the Dutch civilians caught in the path of Market Garden, the battle brought not just the promise of liberation, but also devastation and grief. Villages along Hell's Highway were turned into battlegrounds, their homes shattered by artillery and tank fire. Families who had greeted Allied paratroopers with flowers soon found their homes reduced to rubble. In Arnhem, entire neighborhoods were leveled as German tanks blasted houses used as strongpoints by British paratroopers. Civilians fled into cellars, clutching children as walls collapsed above them. Many carried white sheets, hoping to signal their non-combatant status, but shells and bullets rarely discriminated. Farmhouses and barns, once shelters of comfort, became field hospitals filled with the groans of the wounded. Some families hid soldiers at enormous personal risk, smuggling food and water to them under the noses of German patrols. Others watched helplessly as their sons were conscripted for forced labor or executed in reprisals. Liberation had come to the Netherlands in fragments, but for many it felt like another occupation of fire and ruin. The aftermath of Arnhem brought a brutal German response to civilian resistance. The population of the city was expelled almost entirely, ordered to leave their homes with only what they could carry. Tens of thousands of civilians were driven from Arnhem and Oosterbeek, trudging through mud and rain toward refugee camps and villages already strained by scarcity. Their houses were looted or burned, possessions scattered across empty streets. Those who resisted or tried to stay behind faced arrest, deportation, or execution. German soldiers, enraged by the stubborn defense of the British, took their fury out on civilians suspected of aiding the enemy. Many Dutch men were sent to forced labor in Germany, torn from their families with little hope of return. Women and children, left behind, faced starvation as their homes and fields were destroyed. The once vibrant city of Arnhem became a ghost town, its silence broken only by the echo of boots and the rumble of tanks. Civilians had become targets in a war that no longer distinguished between soldier and bystander. Arnhem was liberated in spirit, but in reality it was left in ruins. The suffering extended far beyond Arnhem itself, spreading across the provinces of Gelderland, Brabant, and beyond. Along Hell's Highway, entire towns were gutted by the passage of war. Sun, Veghel, and Eindhoven bore the scars of tank battles and airstrikes, their streets littered with burned-out vehicles. Civilians dug mass graves for neighbors and family members killed in the fighting. Churches, once sanctuaries, became morgues or field hospitals, their pews soaked in blood. Food became scarce as farms were destroyed or seized by the German army, leaving families to survive on scraps. Children scavenged for potatoes in fields pocked with shell craters, while mothers bartered jewelry for bread. Allied airdrops often missed their targets, falling into German hands or smashing into civilian homes. Every sound of approaching planes brought both hope and fear, hope for supplies, fear of bombs. The people of the Netherlands were enduring not only battle, but also the collapse of their entire way of life. The human cost of Market Garden was etched into every family, every home, every street. The bravery of Dutch civilians in the midst of this chaos was extraordinary. Resistance fighters provided intelligence to the Allies, warning of German reinforcements and hidden tanks near Arnhem. Civilians guided paratroopers through woods and back roads, helping them evade German patrols. Families sheltered wounded soldiers in basements and barns, sharing their last scraps of food with men they had known for only hours. Women carried messages across enemy lines, cycling through fields and villages at the risk of execution. Some smuggled weapons under baskets or bread in carts, sustaining the fight with their courage. Others dug hiding places for Allied airmen and escapes, protecting them even as German searches grew more ruthless. The price of bravery was high. Entire families were executed for sheltering soldiers, their homes burned as punishment. Yet even under the shadow of terror, the Dutch spirit refused to yield. Their courage was the silent backbone of Market Garden. Without them, the Airborne could not have held out as long as they did. But the cost of defiance was terrible, and the German reprisals left scars that would never heal. In Arnhem and surrounding villages, executions of suspected resistance members were common, carried out in public squares as warnings. Civilians were rounded up for deportation to labor camps, their families torn apart. Farms were seized to feed the German army, leaving locals with nothing for the coming winter. Those who tried to hide food faced brutal punishment if caught. German officers declared entire areas off-limits, forcing villagers from their homes and leaving them to wander as refugees. The destruction of infrastructure meant that even when food was available, it could not be transported easily. Fear became part of daily life, a constant shadow in every household. Yet amid this darkness, small acts of defiance persisted: a loaf of bread given to a starving neighbor, a prayer whispered for hidden soldiers. The civilians bore the brunt of Market Garden's failure, their lives shattered by a gamble that had not been theirs to take. They were the silent casualties of Montgomery's grand design. The tragedy of Market Garden was only the beginning of Dutch suffering, for the failure of the operation condemned the Netherlands to another brutal winter under German control. In the months that followed, the occupying forces retaliated against Dutch resistance by imposing food blockades on the western provinces. Rail strikes organized to hinder the German war effort led to draconian punishments, cutting off vital supplies to cities like Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague. The winter of 1944-45 became known as the Hunger Winter, when famine swept across the land. Civilians ate tulip bulbs, sugar beets, and anything that could be boiled into a meager meal. Starvation claimed over 20,000 lives, many of them children and the elderly. Families burned their furniture to stay warm, their houses stripped bare to survive the cold. Disease spread as weakened bodies succumbed to illness. Liberation, once glimpsed in the parachutes over Arnhem, now seemed impossibly distant. The failure of Market Garden had not just cost soldiers their lives, it had condemned an entire nation to months of hunger and despair. Amid this suffering, stories of tragedy and resilience emerged. In Arnhem, families remembered British soldiers who had shared their last rations, even as they themselves went hungry. Children told of nights spent in freezing cellars, their lullabies drowned by the sound of artillery. Mothers recalled carrying buckets of water through sniper fire to quench the thirst of wounded paratroopers. Farmers spoke of hiding Allied soldiers in haylofts, while German patrols searched their barns below. Some civilians never recovered from the trauma of seeing neighbors executed or their homes burned before their eyes. Yet others drew strength from the memory of the Allies' sacrifice, vowing to endure until liberation came. Oral histories preserved after the war are filled with voices that speak of both despair and unbreakable spirit. Market Garden had failed militarily, but it forged a bond between Dutch civilians and the airborne soldiers who had fought for them. That bond was written not in victory, but in shared suffering. The Dutch became not just witnesses to history, but participants in its most tragic chapters. For the Netherlands, the legacy of Market Garden was etched not only in ruins but in memory. The destruction of Arnhem and the hunger winter that followed left scars that lasted generations. Yet within the devastation lay stories of extraordinary bravery, of civilians who risked everything to shelter strangers, to feed the starving, and to defy their oppressors. Their suffering was immense, but so too was their resilience. The failure of the Allies condemned them to more months of occupation, but it also revealed the depth of Dutch courage. Today, the memorials of Arnhem and Oosterbeek honor not just the soldiers who fought, but the civilians who endured. The parachutes that once drifted down from the sky brought both hope and heartbreak. Market Garden became not only a story of military ambition, but of civilian endurance under unimaginable hardship. The Dutch people paid a price far greater than any plan had accounted for. In their suffering, they embodied both the tragedy and the spirit of a nation that refused to break. Operation Market Garden, conceived as a bold stroke to end the war by Christmas, ended instead as a costly failure. The Allied plan to leap across the Rhine at Arnhem had collapsed under the combined weight of flawed strategy, logistical bottlenecks, and fierce German resistance. What began with optimism and airborne triumph ended with retreat, shattered units, and unfulfilled promises. Arnhem Bridge remained in German hands, symbolizing the gap between vision and reality. Thousands of airborne soldiers were dead, wounded, or prisoners, while armored divisions of XX Corps had been bled and delayed. The German army, far from collapsing, had demonstrated resilience and adaptability, holding the line at a moment when the Allies believed them broken. Civilians across the Netherlands, who had cheered liberation, now faced further months of suffering and starvation. The defeat was not just military, but psychological, shaking Allied confidence at a critical juncture of the war. Market Garden had shown the perils of overreaching ambition. The cost of that failure would echo through the coming winter. One of the most immediate consequences of Market Garden's failure was the delay in crossing the Rhine. Montgomery had hoped to seize a bridgehead that would allow the Allies to pour into northern Germany and strike at the Ruhr, the industrial heart of the Reich. Instead, the Rhine remained a formidable barrier, defended by German forces that grew stronger with each passing week. The opportunity for a swift invasion evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of winter warfare. Eisenhower's broad front strategy, already stretched thin, could not muster another such bold thrust until months later. The Allies were forced to regroup, resupply, and prepare for a grinding campaign that would carry into 1945. The Germans, emboldened by their defensive success, strengthened their Rhine positions and prepared counteroffensives. What might have been a decisive breakthrough turned into a drawn-out struggle. Market Garden had gambled on speed, but the result was delay. The war in Europe was prolonged, and with it the suffering of millions. The loss of momentum after Market Garden had cascading effects on Allied operations. Instead of advancing deep into Germany, the Allies were forced into prolonged battles along the Siegfried Line. This fortified belt of defences, with bunkers, dragon's teeth, and minefields, consumed men and resources that might otherwise have been used elsewhere. In the Ardennes, German forces regrouped for one last counterstroke, the Battle of the Bulge, which caught the Allies by surprise in December. Had Market Garden succeeded, that offensive might never have been possible, as the Germans would have lacked the time and space to recover. Instead, the Allies spent the autumn fighting for villages and ridges in Belgium and western Germany, advancing at a crawl. Supplies dwindled, morale sagged, and the sense of inevitability that followed Normandy was shaken. Market Garden had not only failed to shorten the war, but had given the Germans breathing space. The dream of ending the war by Christmas died on the banks of the Rhine. The price would be paid in blood through the cold months ahead. The failure also strained relationships within the Allied command. Montgomery's insistence on the plan, despite warnings from intelligence and his peers, left a bitter legacy. Eisenhower, who had reluctantly approved the operation, grew frustrated with his British subordinates' ambition and inflexibility. American commanders, particularly Patton and Bradley, used the failure to argue against Montgomery's narrow thrust approach, championing instead the broad front strategy. General Sosabowski, the Polish commander who had warned of the risks, was scapegoated and unfairly dismissed, while his brigade's sacrifice went underappreciated for decades. British commanders defended the bravery of their men, but struggled to explain the flawed planning that had doomed them. Tensions between the Allies, though not breaking the coalition, simmered beneath the surface. Market Garden exposed the fragility of unity when egos and rivalries collided. For the soldiers who fought, such disputes were an insult to their sacrifice. The failure became not only a military setback, but also a political wound within the alliance. Trust, once shaken, was slow to rebuild. For the Germans, Market Garden was a much-needed victory at a moment of crisis. Their armies, reeling from Normandy, found new strength in halting the Allied advance. Propaganda trumpeted Arnhem as proof of German resilience, boosting morale at home and in the ranks. Field Marshal models rapid response, and the tenacity of SS units gave the Reich a reprieve it desperately needed. Factories in the Ruhr continued to produce weapons, prolonging the war machine that might otherwise have collapsed under Allied pressure. Civilians in the Reich took heart from the victory, believing the Allies could still be held back. On the front lines, German soldiers gained confidence that they could resist, even against overwhelming odds. Arnhem became a rallying cry for the Wehrmacht, proof that discipline and determination could turn the tide. Yet the victory was costly, consuming men and resources that Germany could ill afford. Market Garden had given the Germans time, but time bought at the price of further suffering. It was a triumph of delay, not of destiny. The cost to the Allied airborne divisions was immense. The British 1st Airborne was effectively destroyed as a fighting force, suffering over 8,000 casualties out of 10,000 men deployed. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions endured heavy losses as well, though they maintained their cohesion. Polish forces, already marginalized, carried scars of betrayal and neglect. Survivors of Arnhem returned not in triumph but in silence, haunted by memories of comrades left behind. For many, captivity in German prison camps awaited, where hunger and cold added to their ordeal. The divisions required months to recover, and some never regained their former strength. Veterans carried the weight of Market Garden with them long after the war ended. Their valor was unquestionable, but their sacrifice had been squandered by flawed strategy. For the airborne, Arnhem was both a badge of honor and a wound that never healed. Their courage could not erase the futility of the mission. For the Dutch, the consequences of Market Garden were catastrophic. The failure condemned much of the country to continued occupation, and with it starvation and repression. The hunger winter of 1944-45 claimed thousands of lives as German reprisals cut off food supplies to the western provinces. Families ate tulip bulbs and scraps, while children wasted away in freezing cities. Resistance fighters were hunted ruthlessly, and civilians who had aided the Allies faced execution or deportation. The joy of seeing paratroopers fall from the sky turned into bitterness as liberation slipped away. For Arnhem, the price was especially high, its population expelled, its homes destroyed, its people scattered. Dutch civilians had risked everything, and they paid the price for a plan that failed. Their suffering was not counted in battle reports, but in empty stomachs, lost homes, and graves. Market Garden was not just a military defeat, but a human tragedy. The Dutch bore its heaviest burden long after the guns fell silent. In the grand sweep of the war, Market Garden stands as a lesson in the limits of ambition. The operation demonstrated the dangers of underestimating the enemy, overextending supply lines, and gambling on perfect coordination. It delayed the crossing of the Rhine, prolonged the war, and inflicted needless suffering on soldiers and civilians alike. Yet it also revealed the resilience of men under impossible circumstances, the courage of the paratroopers, the tenacity of engineers, the sacrifice of civilians. Arnhem became legend, not for victory, but for valor, a story told in equal parts admiration and sorrow. Strategically, it was a failure. Symbolically, it became immortal. The war would continue through the brutal winter, through the Ardennes, and into Germany itself before victory was achieved. Market Garden was meant to end the war, but instead it reminded the Allies that no plan is immune to reality. Its legacy is written in both blood and memory. Arnhem was the bridge too far that defined a campaign, and a cautionary tale for generations. In the immediate aftermath of Market Garden, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery defended the operation with characteristic stubbornness. He insisted that the plan had been 90% successful, and argued that the failure at Arnhem was only a minor setback in the larger Allied advance. To Montgomery, the operation had been bold, imaginative, and necessary to seize the initiative before winter. Critics, however, found such claims difficult to reconcile with the thousands of casualties and the strategic stalemate that followed. Montgomery placed blame on poor weather, delayed drops, and the slow advance of XXX Corps, rather than on the plan itself. He praised the courage of the airborne troops, yet downplayed the risks he had chosen to ignore. His insistence on defending Market Garden became part of his larger rivalry with American generals, particularly Patton, who derided the plan as reckless. Montgomery's reputation, once burnished by El Alamein, became increasingly contested. Market Garden was his gamble, and history would not let him forget it. To his admirers he remained bold, to his critics dangerously overconfident. The controversy surrounding Market Garden deepened as historians examined its flaws. Analysts pointed to the decision to drop airborne divisions far from their objectives, exposing them to delays and German counterattacks. Others highlighted the underestimation of German strength, particularly the presence of SS Panzer divisions refitting near Arnhem. Intelligence warnings supplied by Dutch resistance and ultra-decrypts were ignored or dismissed. The plan's reliance on a single narrow highway was seen as a critical weakness, leaving the armoured spearhead vulnerable to ambush and delay. Historians also questioned the ambitious timeline, which required perfect coordination across air, land, and supply elements that rarely aligned in practice. Some argued that Eisenhower should have reined in Montgomery's ambition, enforcing a more cautious approach. Others countered that daring risks were sometimes necessary in war, even if they failed. The debate has endured for decades, ensuring Market Garden remains one of the most studied operations of the Second World War. Its flaws have become as legendary as its vision. For the airborne divisions, Market Garden became both a badge of honour and a haunting memory. The British 1st Airborne, devastated at Arnhem, was never the same again, its losses too great to recover. Survivors carried the scars of captivity, wounds and trauma long after the war ended. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne earned admiration for their grit at Nijmegen and Eindhoven, though their sacrifices were overshadowed by the tragedy at Arnhem. The Polish 1st Parachute Brigade, unfairly scapegoated, eventually gained recognition decades later for its valor. Among veterans, there remained pride in their endurance, but also bitterness at the futility of their mission. They remembered comrades lost, civilians who had sheltered them, and the feeling of abandonment as relief never came. For many, Arnhem was not a defeat of spirit but of circumstance, a testament to their courage against impossible odds. The paratroopers became legends, their red berets and screaming eagle insignias symbols of sacrifice. Market Garden was remembered not just as failure, but as a story of extraordinary human resilience. In the Netherlands, the memory of Market Garden lived on in ways both painful and proud. Arnhem and Oosterbeek, devastated by battle, rebuilt their shattered homes and honoured the soldiers who had fought among them. Each year, Dutch civilians and schoolchildren placed flowers on the graves of paratroopers, ensuring their sacrifices would never be forgotten. Streets were renamed, monuments erected, and memorial services became traditions that bound the living to the fallen. Yet the memory was also marked by sorrow, as families recalled expulsions, reprisals, and the hunger that followed. The Dutch remembered not just liberation, but also the costs of its delay. To them, Market Garden symbolized both hope and heartbreak. The bond between civilians and veterans became one of the most enduring legacies of the battle. Liberation had not come in 1944, but the gratitude of the Dutch people ensured the memory of those who tried was preserved. Arnhem was etched into the nation's identity as both tragedy and testament. Strategically, historians often frame Market Garden as an example of ambition outpacing logistics. The plan assumed speed, surprise, and seamless coordination, yet none of these elements aligned. The Allies had underestimated their enemy, believing the German army too shattered to resist effectively. Instead, they encountered resilience, improvisation, and ruthless counterattacks. The result demonstrated the danger of underestimating an opponent and the folly of relying on perfect execution in war. For military strategists, Market Garden became a case study in overreach, often taught in staff colleges as a cautionary tale. Its lessons emphasized the importance of intelligence, supply, and flexibility over grandiose vision. Some argue that failure accelerated learning, preparing the Allies for the eventual crossing of the Rhine in 1945. Others contend that it was an avoidable disaster, unnecessary in the broader campaign. Either way, Market Garden shaped Allied strategy for the remainder of the war. It reminded commanders that boldness could inspire but also destroy. The phrase "a bridge too far," coined after the battle, entered history as the defining metaphor of Market Garden. It captured the essence of the operation, a daring vision stretched beyond what reality could support. For the public, it came to symbolize the balance between ambition and folly. Books, documentaries, and films, most notably Richard Attenborough's epic A Bridge Too Far, cemented the battle in cultural memory. The story of Market Garden was retold as both inspiration and warning, highlighting bravery while acknowledging failure. For veterans, the phrase carried mixed emotions, evoking pride in their fight, but sorrow in its futility. In classrooms and war colleges, it became shorthand for the dangers of overextending one's reach. Arnhem became not just a place, but a symbol, a reminder of what happens when vision collides with reality. Few battles have produced such a perfect metaphor. Market Garden's legacy endures because its story transcends time. Despite its failure, some historians argue that Market Garden had limited strategic value in wearing down German reserves. By forcing the Wehrmacht to commit its SS Panzer divisions in the Netherlands, the Allies disrupted enemy deployments elsewhere. The German army, already strained, spent men and material it could not easily replace. In this sense, Arnhem bought time, even if it did not bring victory. Yet this interpretation remains controversial, as the losses endured by the Allies far outweighed the benefits. The destruction of the British 1st Airborne was an irreplaceable cost, and the Dutch paid the heaviest price in suffering. Still, in war, even failure can shape the path of eventual victory. Market Garden did not end the war, but it did influence the course of campaigns that followed. The debate continues among scholars, ensuring the operation remains one of the most dissected battles of the Second World War. Its legacy is layered, complex, and deeply human. In the end, the legacy of Market Garden rests in a paradox, a daring vision that inspired and a tragic miscalculation that doomed it. Montgomery defended it, historians debated it, and veterans lived with it, but none could deny its place in history. For the Allies, it was a lesson in humility. For the Dutch, a chapter of endurance; for the Germans, a fleeting reprieve. Its story is remembered not just in maps and strategies, but in the voices of soldiers and civilians who lived through it. Market Garden endures because it embodies both the heights of human courage and the depths of human error. It was at once a tale of heroism and heartbreak, of boldness and blindness. The bridges of Holland became symbols, not of victory, but of the fragile line between triumph and tragedy. Arnhem was not liberated in September 1944, but it was immortalized. Market Garden's legacy is not of what was gained, but of what was lost. And in that loss lies one of the most enduring lessons of war.